Welcome to the third hearing of the inquiry into the privatisation of bus services. Before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are meeting today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today and anyone watching on the live stream. Today we will be hearing from Waverley Council and several private bus operators in New South Wales. I thank everyone for making the time to give evidence to this very important inquiry. While we have many witnesses with us in person, some will be appearing via video conference today, and I note that we also have some members of the committee who are appearing by video conference today as well. I'd ask for everyone's patience through any technical difficulties that we may encounter. If participants lose their internet connection and are disconnected from the hearings, they're asked to rejoin the hearing by using the same link as provided by the committee secretariat to them previously. Before we commence, I'd like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. Today's hearing is being broadcast live via the Parliament's website. The proceedings are also being recorded and a transcript will be placed on the committee's website once it becomes available. In accordance with the broadcasting guidelines, media representatives are reminded that they must take responsibility for what they publish about the committee's proceedings. While parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses giving evidence today, it does not apply to what witnesses say outside of their evidence at the hearing. I therefore urge witnesses to be careful about comments that you may make to the media or to others after you complete your evidence today. Committee hearings are not intended to provide a forum for people to make adverse reflections about others under the protection of parliamentary privilege, and in that regard it's important that witnesses focus on the issues raised by the inquiry terms of reference and avoid naming individuals unnecessarily. All witnesses do have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution passed by the House in 2018. If witnesses are unable to answer a question today and want more time to respond, they can take a question on notice. Written answers to questions taken on notice are to be provided within 21 days. In terms of the audibility of the hearing today, I remind both committee members and witnesses to speak into the microphone. And finally, could everyone please turn their mobile phones to silent for the duration of the hearing. So with that out of the way, I now welcome our first witnesses. Could I please ask each of you to state your name and position title and then swear either the oath or the affirmation? I'll start with you, Councillor.
Thank you. I'm Councillor Paula Marcellus and I'm the Mayor of Waverley Council. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Yabuka.
And I'm Clint Yabuka, Manager of Strategic Transport at Waverley Council. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. And would you like to begin by by giving a short opening statement?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And thank you very much for the opportunity to appear, because I know this has been an extra session that was put on, so very appreciative. Now, Waverley Council is actually only 9 square kilometres, but with a population of about 75,000, it is one of the most densely populated LGAs in Australia. And during summer, Waverley plays host to significant numbers of visitors to our beaches, including Bondi and Bronte beaches, and of course backpackers when the borders open a bit more and tourism really starts coming back. So in addressing you this morning, I really do want to emphasise that our community has a high reliance on public transport and in particular buses. And we also fall within Region 9, which also includes the Waverley Bus Depot and the Bondi Junction interchange, which during morning peaks is the third busiest behind Central and Town Hall, with approximately 3 million commuters a year. Region 9 has the highest patronage of any region in the Sydney bus network, with 68 million trips, or 21% of the total across the network, so very high patronage. A major challenge for Waverley is traffic congestion, which continues to rise as more and more multi-unit dwellings are built and summer temperatures continue to rise. Public transport, therefore, is a major strategic transport mode to help take cars off the road and to move people around and to help us meet our net zero 2030 emissions target. On key corridors in Waverley, such as Bondi Road and Old South Head Road, before COVID, they carried the same number of people daily via bus services as by all private vehicles. At Waverley, we've been fighting to save our buses since 2017, since bus routes began to be cancelled or consolidated and bus stops moved in preparation for privatisation. And we can go into those examples a bit later on if you wish. But significantly, it's the social contract and equity considerations provided by public transport that are most important for us. Buses, the most flexible of public transport modes, ensure people can move around our LGA. People used to be able to get to their medical appointments at the War Memorial Hospital in St Vincent's easily, but no more. The 361 was cancelled because, according to Opal data, this route failed to meet their high patronage targets. That is, buses were not full enough for enough of the time. The implications of this type of thinking is scary. The profit imperative has not been offset by the social, health and wellbeing benefits of keeping this service when it was in public hands. I thought this is why we pay taxes, to have services. Now that our services have been privatised, how many more bus routes will be cancelled because they have been deemed unprofitable? Where is the community's guarantee of service? The contractual obligation for on-time running has seen serious ramifications for Waverley. The target of 95% is unrealistic in such dense urban environments and high patronage, resulting in reduced service levels, poor ride experiences, and forcing more people into cars. We also have serious issues with our bus depot constantly under threat. It is a major key piece of infrastructure, and Transport for New South Wales have actually admitted there are fewer buses in our bus depot now. This is very serious. If the bus depot goes, where are the remaining buses going to go? Further afield, which means potentially increased fares in order to cover the extra petrol that the private bus operators are going to have to actually meet. And what happens when electrification actually comes? Where are the buses going to be able to charge? Where is the room? The eastern suburbs is full. In closing, the experience of other privatised networks, such as Area 6, demonstrates an incremental diminution of services which impacts upon the livability of our LGA. We strongly object to the public purse being used to subsidise commercial operations that are geared to making a profit rather than fulfilling a social contract, which is what our public utilities are meant to provide. I humbly request that our buses come back into public hands. Certainly, while they could be improved, the system wasn't broken, but it is now, we think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will begin with questions from the opposition. The Honourable Mark Buttigieg.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for appearing, Mayor Marcellos and Mr. Yabuka. It's much appreciated and very valuable evidence. I just wanted to take you to the level of consultation, to the degree that there was any, between Transport for New South Wales and the community prior to this outsourcing, privatisation, whatever we wish to call it. Could you outline to the committee what level of consultation there was?
Well, very little consultation, in fact, and this is one of the reasons why we've been fighting so hard since 2018. We've had the 378 was stopped, the 440 bus service was cancelled, there was no direct bus service into the city, the 379 was introduced without consultation, so all of this was done without consultation, and Mr. Yabuka has even more of this. And this has been one of the major concerns. We did have a meeting recently with some high-level members of the community engagement team from Transport for New South Wales, and they did admit that their community consultation was poor. Again, we had this very recently with the change of entrance to the bus depot to allow the cycleway. And again, there was very little or no community consultation. In fact, it was after the fact, and it was actually consultation to validate their position rather than to actually determine what the best approach would be.
So the information I have is that Transport for New South Wales actually cut 25 bus routes from the eastern suburbs. I mean, I can read them all out, some of which you've already mentioned. Does that sound right? Yes,
it's potentially more, I think, and Mr. Yabuka can probably validate that. But it's not only the bus routes, but it's the bus stops as well. And people have to travel further to actually catch a bus, and there are fewer services as well.
So 25 routes or more, and in terms of bus stops, do we know how many of those have been eliminated?
I've heard the figure of 50, but that would need to be validated, Mr.
We
Yabuka.
need to validate that.
We can come back to you and confirm that.
Okay, so no consultation, what seems to be quite a drastic cut in routes and stops. What was the? I mean, we heard evidence in earlier hearings that there was a motivation behind this because Transport for New South Wales were concerned about doubling up with the light rail. Have you got any information to that effect?
Well, Waverley is not, we don't use the light rail service because we would in fact have to, well, our commuters would have to double back in order to catch the light rail. The bus services that we have in Waverley, as I said, we used to actually have services that would go direct into the city. All our bus services now go into the Bondi Junction interchange. We have over 3 million commuters using that per year. It's also a very dangerous interchange, and in fact we had a death there a couple of years ago when a woman was run over by a bus. It is extremely crowded. So the attempt to push people onto the light rail is a problem, because we also have people who pass through Waverley, and it is very, very serious. The impact is significant, and we've seen a diminution of services since the light rail was introduced.
And that interchange issue, has there been any indications from the government that they're concerned about this or willing to help? Or
we have moved notices of motion to actually improve signage. It is on the agenda. It has been raised. There is a plan for council to sell Rose Street, which goes into the interchange, as a way of trying to change the entrance to a safer approach, but that's taking a long time. So it is on the agenda, but I don't believe it's moving fast enough.
And in terms of those cuts, there was also other evidence we heard whereby they were contrived to, if you like, make the market more attractive for a prospective, or make it more justifiable to outsource for a prospective buyer. What's your view on that?
Well, given that we've had so many services cut, particularly services that go within Waverley, like the 361, where people are actually ferried to services, the impression is that yes, that would be the case. And that's one of the reasons why we've been fighting so hard since 2018, including writing letters to the Minister. The community was so concerned, we actually hired a bus to Bega to actually protest to the Minister. Unfortunately, he wasn't available to see us. So yes, the view was that the services have been cut so that it's the profitable routes that are the ones that remain. The question is whether they will remain.
And those, to be clear, those cuts were made prior to the privatisation. In other words, you reduce the services, presumably the complaints to council from the community rise, and then it's, well, the previous service weren't doing that well anyway, so what are you complaining about?
Exactly, and they were relying on Opal data, and as we know, the Opal readers weren't always reliable. But Mr. Yabuka has actually compiled a number of bus routes that are cut. So perhaps if I can ask him to just itemise those.
Indeed. So what's important to recognise is that this has been occurring since a review of bus operations in Region 9 since 2018. So we're aware that privatisation has been on the agenda for a number of years.
Could I ask you to bring the microphone slightly forward?
Apologies.
Thank you.
So in 2018, we in fact began losing bus routes and bus stops just within Waverley. So we lost 6 routes as part of that review, and these were routes that were highly utilised. These were express routes from Bondi Beach through to Bondi Junction, the rail interchange, and there were modifications to other routes. Now, this again occurred in late 21 with the modification of routes, where we lost another 8 direct routes just within Waverley. That's part of the larger number of 26 routes. and others that were modified. It concerns me that this will continue. So that process in 21, in fact, consolidated a number of routes along key corridors. So Bondi Road, Bronte Road are both transit corridors. They now operate less bus services that reach less destinations. They now operate as high-frequency routes, so arguably the capacity is still there, but the public benefit has been diminished because people cannot reach the destinations they used to be able to reach via those bus services.
So in order for these companies to remain profitable, what you essentially do is truncate the routes to the main arterials, maximise capacity, and the poor old person living down in the back blocks might have to walk 20 minutes to get to the same bus that they would have otherwise got near their door, basically.
Indeed. So a route that may have distributed through a suburb south of Waverley. So I acknowledge that the routes within Waverley are substantially unchanged, but for either a Waverley resident travelling south into Randwick or for a Randwick resident travelling through Waverley, the accessibility of those bus services has been reduced, yes.
Can we just pause to unpick just a couple of the things that Mr. Buttigieg has been discussing? So firstly, in relation to the sort of the Opal data being used as a substitute for consultation, I raised this issue a few years ago in relation to a Cherrybrook service where the Department of Transport had told me that they had done consultation. It ended up being the consultation was looking at the Opal data, which of course is not the same as true community consultation. Did you ask the Minister or Transport for New South Wales as to exactly which data they were using? Were they looking, for example, at where a person was changing buses, or were they looking purely at numbers of trips registered on particular routes?
Well, I certainly tried to get that information, but they were not forthcoming. Now, I don't know whether Mr. Yabuka, at an officer-to-officer level, you were able to glean that. But there has been so much, it's been so very opaque. And we certainly did challenge the use of Opal data, but to no real effect, unfortunately. And as we know, the Opal readers aren't always reliable. And as I said again, there is a social contract here. There are obligations, and I think that has been completely swept aside in actually understanding why we're actually providing bus services in the first place.
And I think, I'll pass back to Mr. Buttigieg in a minute, but I think I'd like to pick up on that as well, because I think that came through clearly in your opening statement as well. We had a budget estimate session yesterday with some of the more senior transport officials, and as part of that we were talking about their fare-free days and how the driver behind a fare-free day was obviously not about making money off of transport, but getting people into the city or to tourist locations where they were able to spend money and to reinvigorate the economy. That is a prime example of what you're talking about, I think, in terms of we expect services not, we expect transport services not to make a profit by themselves, but to contribute to the broader kind of ongoing operation of society. Is that
exactly
what you're getting at?
Why we pay taxes. We expect the government to provide services, and you know we're happily able to do that. However, when it is the public purse that is actually subsidising a private operator who, on top of that, is running a commercial enterprise and is making profits, and at the same time we're seeing a diminution in service and that social contract being undermined, so that it is in fact making it a lot more difficult, not only for our most vulnerable, but also for our school children going to school, but also for our environment and our health and well-being. When there is so much congestion and people are being forced into their cars, you know, we're leading to a community that will in time be dysfunctional because it is just too stressed.
And are you able to, have you got any sort of data, or have you done any research on what the impact of the reduced routes has been on visitors to the area or local businesses?
Mm-hmm. We've had, I've been gathering some data since 2018, and some of the testimonials we've had, people are saying things like they have to walk a lot further in order to get to Oxford Street and Newland Street. It's very dangerous crossings for elderly or somewhat a bit slow to get across. People are confused. But on top of that, other than the fact that people are saying they also have had up to an extra hour added to their commute times because they're all now having to go into the Bondi Junction interchange rather than have direct routes into the city. And I presume that's now trying to force people onto trains, and I'm very suspicious about what that means and whether it means that the Eastern Suburbs line is also going to be slated for privatisation. We are concerned to collect data, and so we've now just set up an email address, buscomplaints@waverley.nsw.gov.au. It's only very new, and we'll be advertising that because we want to make sure that we get the data. But we're also taking calls from our customer service centre as well, because people see council as their first port of call. I mean, council seems to get blamed for everything, so we're very serious about being an advocate for our community.
Can I just take you up on that, because I think this is a very important point. I mean, it's in theory, I mean, I don't think the travelling public would have an issue if the service levels were maintained and they were getting a good provision of service. Like, for example, on the Central Coast, I understand things are going quite well there because it's a small boutique operator who services the requirements of the community. But under the previous regime, which was operated by State Transport Authority, what was the mechanism for a member of the travelling public saying that there was an issue, or were they sort of in touch with council and then you had direct liaison with Transport for New South Wales? So what I'm trying to get at is, was there a more direct interface when STA were running the show?
Yes, there was. So at that time, we encouraged residents to approach council, but there was also a direct line and a direct email, I believe a web form even, for STA customers or patrons to directly respond to the operator. So anecdotally, the 339 that runs along Waverley Road was one of the most vocal routes within the Sydney bus network.
Yeah. So now you've got this situation where the private operator is running the show. What is the accountability mechanism for the travelling public?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? We do have the Waverley Traffic Committee, and the private operator has been invited to attend. They have yet to attend, and there have been at least 2 opportunities now. But this is the challenge. I think it is quite opaque.
Can I just get that right? So the Traffic Committee for Council invites the private operator to come along in a circumstance where it's known to have been controversial and there's issues and complaints, and they haven't turned up. Right.
Correct.
Yep.
So they've had 2 opportunities now. So we will be following up with them to see what the issue is. But certainly it's the lack of accountability that is the concern for us, and the representation on the Waverley Traffic Committee is important because that opens up the relationship and it gives us a much more direct opportunity. But it really is through council and through the councillors that I think people will have recourse.
And what would you say? I mean, I'm assuming that if we have the operators here, they would say to you, look, the government specifies the bus stops, the routes. They give us the KPIs. We've got service levels to meet. 95, and we're doing all that. So what's the issue? What would be your response to that?
Well, I think part of the challenge is whether the service levels are appropriate. Set at 95% in areas that are very dense is a challenge, particularly when you're dealing with roads like Bondi Road, Old South Head Road. We have high patronage. it has a significant impact on the timetables and the routes. And by having them at the table, it allows us to actually discuss these issues so that they can actually perhaps advocate for themselves to Transport for New South Wales and to the government about whether some of their KPIs are actually realistic, because we know that there are impacts in terms of the quality of the drive, the bus drivers themselves, because we know that there is a pay discrepancy, but also potentially cutting of routes, because if they're not meeting their KPIs, then what's the first thing that will happen? They will either stop more bus routes or they will advocate for the reduction of certain routes. So we're very concerned about what this all means. Also, if they're finding that some of these routes are not as profitable as they were led to believe for whatever reason, there is no guarantee that those routes will remain in the longer term.
So, just to unpack that a little bit, so is it a case that in order to realistically try and meet levels of service provision and KPIs, you've got less routes and less stops, which makes it more achievable, so that the cross-subsidisation under the previous regime, STA if you like, of bus stops in back streets and different routes servicing people who would otherwise have to walk a long distance, for example, then it's kind of like a false parameter, isn't it? Because it looks good on paper, but what about all those people off the main arterial roads who aren't getting serviced? Is that it in a nutshell?
Absolutely, but even on the main arterial roads, where, like Bondi Road, for example, where there has been a reduction in bus stops, it's a major shopping area. You have people carrying shopping. You've got mothers with prams. You've got elderly people, and the fact that they have to walk much further makes it very difficult. So people say, "Fine, I won't go there. I'll drive into." Bondi Junction at Westfield, which is a nightmare to go up there. So we need to ensure we have our shopping strips in our local areas.
And those, Councillor Marcellus, those high street businesses, have they raised this as an issue with you?
There have been potential issues, particularly around things like clearways and those sorts of things and the impacts it has on buses. But when we were actually fighting to not have a tram go down or a light rail go down Bondi Road, the shopkeepers were very concerned, because it also meant a complete reduction of stops. I think it was only 3 in the whole of Bondi Road. And the store owners were extremely concerned about that, as were people who use those high streets, because it meant that they would be less accessible to them.
And can you touched on the byproduct of bus drivers, I think you said less experienced bus drivers coming into the system as a result of pay disparities. Did you want to elaborate on the effects of that's having on the service?
Yes, it's very interesting, because it's the quality of the ride. We experienced that with one of the bus drivers we hired to go down to Bega, and he was probably a casual driver, and we had some STA trained drivers on the bus with us, and there was a noticeable difference in terms of the quality of the ride, and also the knowledge of the routes and the areas as well. Now, I don't know, Mr. Yabuka, whether you've got other insights into that, but certainly, anecdotally, that's some of the information that I've been provided.
And yes, I'll support that. Anecdotally, that has been my experience as a bus patron. So the variability of driver skill level across the routes I've caught recently has been far greater than in the past. So there are drivers who are clearly inexperienced and undertrained, operating buses right now. I caught a 350 the other day, and the driver struggled to manoeuvre that bus down Bronte Road, which is a bus corridor.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? In that case, Mr. Yabuka?
Yes.
What did you do? Did you report to the bus company? Did you make a complaint to... did you report it in any way? I know that obviously you can highlight the route, you can highlight the time, you can do all that. You've probably got it on your Opal data. Did you make any complaint whatsoever?
I'm unaware of the current mechanism to report that.
Did you seek to find out how to make a complaint?
In fairness, no, I have not sought.
Thank you.
However, it does point to the fact that Mr. Yabuka is a transport expert, and if he's experiencing this and wasn't readily available, then it would be a lot more difficult for our residents who perhaps are not used to this bureaucracy. And that's one of the reasons why we've set up the bus complaints email at Waverley Council, because we see ourselves as advocates for our community.
But councillor, on the same point, if he is a transport expert, he saw unsafe or untrained drivers operating a bus, yet didn't report it, I would say that that is more of a reflection on you, sir, and your failure, given that you're testifying to this committee, that you were a witness to this. Then, you know, I think
Order,
that
is this a
Mr.
question?
Fang, I just
Could
don't
you-
think that that's a fair summation.
Well, then,
Could I ask you, Mr. Fang, to come to a question? Is this an assertion you're putting that you're
well, it's
asking?
an assertion followed by a question. I haven't quite got to the question yet. Would you agree that it's perhaps a failure of your role to have not reported it if you had concerns?
Under the circumstances, no. However, I think that's a valid point that we will be exploring what the complaints mechanism is with the operator and making that available to our residents.
Thank you.
Because the other thing that we need to be looking at is the frequency of this as well. So how often this is happening. And this is why we're setting up complaints mechanisms so the council can actually collect the data.
Yes, Mr. Rathel, I do caution members to try and stay close to the terms of reference. Continue.
I will. So I've got a sort of slightly different set of questions. But Mr. Yabuka, with the 20 bus routes that you said have been cancelled, or I think you've got a map there, is it? Would you be able to either table that or maybe take on notice what that information and provide it to the committee?
The tally of those changed bus routes?
Yeah.
Yes.
That could be quite useful. I suppose, obviously, I mean, would you agree that obviously bus routes need to be constantly reviewed, and just because there's a way that it's always been done doesn't mean that that's necessarily the most efficient way of doing it in the future. And so that if a bus were to go down a certain street or stop at a certain place that it's always been at, you know, for years and years, of course, if you change where the bus stops, it's going to annoy some people, but you might annoy, say, 5, but benefit 50. So obviously there is, if you don't hear it from the 50 that benefit, that might get a slight benefit, you might get the 5 people that complain about their service not being as good as perhaps it was previously, but you often don't hear about the 50 that benefit. Is that a fair?
Well, we're not saying you don't review buses, but a number of the buses that were cut were buses that were highly popular, very well used, and like the 378 that went from Bronte Beach into Town Hall, there was no reason to cut that because it was well used and moved a lot of people. The big issue here, though, is that there was no consultation. So it's fine to look at reviewing your buses, but do it in consultation with your community. That way then you can actually work out exactly what's going on the ground, whether a bus should be removed or not, or modified, whether a bus stop should be removed, and then you actually have the community with you, and you can then bring the community with you in the changes. That has not happened. It has been imposed by people who don't really understand what's going on the ground.
Can I just interrogate that point then? So my understanding of Mr. Rath's question was, you know, you make changes and some people will be unhappy and other people will be happy, and you're trying to sort of get something that makes more people happy than not. But in your evidence, when you were referring to the changes you've seen to bus routes and bus stops, were you talking about new routes coming in and replacing old ones, or were you talking about and new bus stops like being replacing old ones, or are you talking about just there being fewer routes and fewer bus stops?
Well, it's a bit of a mix, actually. If we take the 378, for example, that was actually cut way back in 2015, I think it was. That was a very, very popular bus route that was carrying lots of people, and it went right into the city, so people didn't have to get off at Bondi Junction. That was replaced by the 440 that went from Rozelle initially into the city, and then it came across to Bronte. And people were very frustrated with that because it took a lot longer, because it not only had to go across Parramatta Road, it also had to go down Bondi Road and Oxford Street, some very, very significantly busy major routes. And so, of course, that was a disaster because a lot of people were, delayed. There were lots of delays. And then the 440 was replaced by the 379, which went from Bronte to North Bondi. And the worst bit about that was that people, it wasn't clearly labelled. People were thinking they were going to Bronte, but in fact we're ending up in North Bondi. We don't need a service like that. It just went from Bronte to Bondi Junction over to North Bondi. So there was a lot of confusion. And a lot of people still say to me, I don't need to go to North Bondi from Bronte. What's the point of this? So again, if there was consultation, and there was a good reason to do that, then fine, the community would have understood. But, it was imposed, and even to this very day, people are still complaining.
Just to round that out then, Mr. Yabuka, when you referred to the 20 routes that have been lost, are you able to also tell us new routes that have replaced those routes, or have there not been any?
There have been a number of routes that have been consolidated. Mm-hmm. And where, if I describe it as the head of the route, say beginning at Bondi Junction interchange, the corridor that runs through Waverley has remained the same. The tail of that route, where it distributes through Coogee, Maroubra, etc., have been cut and pasted, is the most direct way to put it. So there has been, in that cutting and pasting process, where say 3 or 4 routes have been consolidated and then had the second half of the route amended, there has been a loss of coverage through that cutting and pasting process.
Okay, so right. So that's the point then, is it's servicing a smaller area of, right, okay.
And to return to Mr. Rath's point, that where there may be a small number of people that are complaining about being disadvantaged, the challenge is that the consolidation of those routes along key corridors in fact reduces the overall network coverage.
But it also you would agree, wouldn't you, that there also needs to be value for money. So I understand that we need to provide a service to people within the Waverley LGA, but if only 3 people are getting on the bus and it's not good value for money, perhaps there are reasons why certain services were cut. Now I understand, Councillor, to your point that certain routes, if they were highly popular and incredibly well used, why were they being cut? And if they weren't being replaced with any alternate service, that's potentially a fair criticism. But there's also an issue of value for money where you can't continue to provide services that aren't well used as well. But those people are the ones who are more likely to complain, not the overall benefit to the system.
I just wanted to ask the question. It's value for money for whom?
Well, to the taxpayer.
Well, it could also be value for money for the people who need to get around. And while it might have 3 people on one schedule, it could very well have a bus full next, depending on what the needs are. So I think we must never actually get away from the fact of this social contract, that it swings and roundabouts, and you're never going to have a bus full all the time. And I think as a government, we have an obligation to our community. It cannot always be run by the profit imperative.
Yeah, just one final question from me, Chair, if that's okay. I live in the eastern suburbs as well, not in Waverley LGA, but I get the 311 bus. We are the last area, or I think one of the last areas in the entire state to have a private bus
Yes.
service. I think why all of the other areas, or a lot of other areas, seem to be okay with the private bus service. In fact, some areas have only ever had a private service. The Eastern Suburbs is one of the last. But just picking up on something you said in your opening statement about how the government should take back, I think you said put these bus services back into public hands. It's incredibly unrealistic to suggest that when the government has contracts with private bus providers, whether it is in the eastern suburbs or Western Sydney or the Central Coast or whatever, to say that the government should basically take back control, rip up these contracts, basically renationalise the service. I understand some of your...
Chair. Is this a proposition or a question?
I don't know, I liked where it was going there.
I'm suggesting that why do you think that is a realistic proposition that you would put it in your opening statement, that the government can simply just take back control of the service? Surely that's unrealistic.
Well,
No.
I would dispute that it is unrealistic. I think it is completely realistic, but I'm not necessarily suggesting that we rip the contracts up straight away, although why not?
Why not?
What's the sovereign risk?
Well,
Well, no, no.
well, I'm
depends
sure
how you do it,
I'm
Mr.
sure
Rath.
there must be out clauses and whatever, but I would think that the reality is that not all the regions have been happy with the rollout of the privatised service. I know there have been significant issues with Region 6, and it continues to be so, and the ongoing potential diminution of services. It's going to get to a point where it will become an issue for the government, I'm pretty sure, because it already is. And I know with the level of complaints that I'm getting from people, it is a concern. And we, as I said, while there may have been need to perhaps fix aspects of the bus network, it was working very well when it was in private hands. And I would like to see it return. In public hands, apologies. And I can't see why it can't return, because I don't believe that we're actually going to get the level of service that we've had. And I don't believe that the public purse should be supporting commercial operations to make a profit. And that also is a risk.
Can I just pursue this, because I think it's a very, very important point. This is a value proposition, and council being the closest form of government to the people, and is in touch with what they're saying and hearing and their needs. What you're saying with this social contract is that, look, there will be a situation where you cannot necessarily treat every individual as an equal economic unit. So someone with a disability living in a back street, or someone who's elderly, has a disproportionate requirement on those services to someone who is able-bodied, young, or lives on a main arterial road. Therefore, the value propositions are inherently unequal if you want to have a society where everyone's provided for. That's essentially what we're saying. And if that's the case, then it follows that there has to be some cross-subsidisation, which means that if you're running a company purely for profit, it's not going to work, is it?
Absolutely. The profit imperative is there, and you're not going to be running lines that are unprofitable.
So we've heard from the government today that if that's a decision that a government makes based on their values, that's fine. But as a council, you're not in touch.
Point of order, Chair.
Well,
Point of order. The Deputy Chair's indicated that we've heard from the government. Now, you've heard from two members of the upper house.
Okay, thank you. I uphold the point of order. If we could refer to the members of the government on the committee.
So the question is that you would prefer a system of values which caters to those people who are disadvantaged or don't live in an appropriate location, rather than a system which rewards profit over public provision.
Absolutely. And in fact, it's not...
That's not what we said.
Well, I'm sorry, that's the way I interpreted it.
Well, that's
Okay,
not what I
order.
said.
This is not an opportunity for...
see-
Order, Mr. Rath. This is not an opportunity for members to talk across one another. The transcript will show what has been said. If we could be careful about representing what others have said. We only have a little bit of time left. If you could finish and make it a question. that would be great.
Very, very quickly, just to finish off, there was a survey regarding community feedback on Region 9 on privatisation. Has that been made available to Waverley Council?
I have not received
No,
it.
I'm not aware of that.
Okay.
Is that the one you
It probably is.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, you can give them a copy.
If I could ask the final question, bring it back onto the, the actual subject matter. I guess just rounding out that discussion then about the idea of bus routes needing to be profitable or value for money. Do you think that in the privatisation of bus services, the government has unnecessarily segmented parts of society in a way that it's actually damaging to the whole of the functioning of the local economy?
I would say absolutely. The reality is, if you look at the bus network, you have to look at it as a holistic system, which actually does cross-subsidise those areas, perhaps, that aren't as profitable. And I think that's why having an integrated system becomes really important. And then that does have impact on the local economy, and it does allow for the broader distribution of people and the way they live and the transport network.
Can I just, Chair, on that same topic then, in that case, given that you're talking about equity and the spread, would you be prepared to forego further services to ensure that regional people had perhaps increased services so that we all had across the state more equity, given that, I think you said you had a 9 square kilometre council area and you've got 75,000 people, yet you've got bus services that I live in Wagga that my community wouldn't even have. So, if you're so prepared to have equity, would you be prepared to forego some of those services so that we could have
Is that the only way the
increased
government
services?
will give things to regions? Really?
No, I'm just...
but equity doesn't...
I'm just wondering how far we're going to spread this concept.
Well, I think that is actually a flawed logic,
Right.
with respect, Mr. Fang, because it's not about for one area foregoing another. It is about whether there is enough service and capacity that's put into the system to be able to accommodate the needs. And with privatisation, I personally am challenging that, because the experience that I'm seeing is that it is not happening. In fact, there is a diminution of services. So maybe it's Wagga needs to subsidise the eastern suburbs, perhaps.
Order. That does bring us to
That's gonna be the quote.
to
That'll be
the
the quote.
end
That will be the
of
quote that'll
this
come out of
session.
this inquiry.
Thank you very much for what has been a lively and interesting...
Prepare for the correspondence from
all right,
Wagga,
order. Lively and interesting discussion. Thank you very much to both of you. To the extent there are questions taken on notice or we have supplementary questions, you'll have 21 days to respond to those, but the committee team will be in touch with you. Thank you very much. Back on. Yep. Okay, welcome back. So I now welcome our next panel of witnesses. If I could ask you each to state your name and position title, and then swear either the oath or the affirmation. And I will start with you, Mr. Rowe.
My name is Byron Rowe. I am the Managing Director of Busways. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And I'll go to you, Mr. Sinclair.
Thank you. Good morning. Jamie Sinclair, Managing Director, New South Wales for Transit Systems. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence are now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And Mr. Balkan.
Good morning and thank you. Greg Balkan, Chief Operating Officer of the Australian Public Transport Division, which includes Transit Systems. I swear that the evidence are now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rowe, I'd like to invite you to make a short opening statement.
Thank you. Good morning and thank you for the opportunity to present and participate in this hearing. So Busways is Australia's largest private bus operator. We're a family business and we're celebrating our 80th birthday this year. We have a fleet of around 1,300 vehicles and 2,800 people. spread across New South Wales and South Australia. We took over the STA Region 7 contract in January 9th this year. And we certainly have a firm view that private operators are able to deliver the same services more efficiently and to a higher quality. And we certainly support the government's decision to franchise the STA's contracts.
Thank you. And Mr. Sinclair or Mr. Balkan?
Thank you, Chair. I'll make a statement if I could. As I mentioned, I'm Jamie Sinclair, Managing Director of New South Wales Transit Systems, and I'm joined today by Greg Balkan, our Chief Operating Officer. We thank the committee for giving us the opportunity to contribute to the inquiry today. Transit Systems provides urban passenger transport services under contract to governments in Australia and Singapore, and we have a long history of successful and efficient service provision. Many of Transit Systems' bus operations have been transitioned from government, and there is no other operator in Australia with comparable experience in successfully transitioning government transport contracts to the private sector. We've been operating competitive tenders, performance-based bus contracts in Australia since 1996. We have been providing bus services to New South Wales since October 2013 and operate two networks in Sydney, the first covering Liverpool, Fairfield and the Parramatta areas, known as Region 3, and the second, the largest region in New South Wales, covering the inner west of Sydney, which includes a permanent and fully integrated on-demand service known as Region 6. In New South Wales, we have a fleet of 822 buses with a staff of close to 1,900 people operating out of 6 depots. Since winning the contracts, Transit Systems' major focus has been on delivering a better customer experience. We are confident we have made significant improvements. In Region 6, our December 2021 certification from the Customer Service Institute of Australia provided the highest level of certification, the score amongst the best achieved by any organisation assessed against the International Customer Service Standard. Additionally, a Transport for New South Wales survey in May 2021 showed an 8% increase in customer satisfaction with a 93% score. Customer complaints have also declined by 40% since the transition of the contracts on July 1, 2018. Our on-time running performance has seen continuous and steady improvement in reliability. Additional trips have been added to the network at no cost to the government or taxpayers, and new bus stop locations have been introduced to provide greater access to bus services for the whole community. We are supporting the New South Wales Government's move to a lower carbon future with a fleet of 55 battery electric buses operating out of our Leichhardt depot. We're extremely encouraged by the response the rollout of electric fleet is receiving, and we look forward to supporting the government continue this important work across our network and the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Commence with questions from the opposition. Mr. Buttigieg.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you all for appearing on what I'm sure will be very valuable evidence to this important inquiry. Mr. Balkan, I might just go to you. I want to pursue this issue which was raised previously with evidence that we'd heard that your company, Transit Systems, have refused to pay back pay to drivers, which was ruled on by the federal court. And isn't this simply a case of outright wage theft?
Point of order, Chair.
Totally disagree with that statement, sorry.
Order, sorry, apologies. Mr. Fang has taken a point of order. What's the point of order, Mr. Fang?
Chair, I think the way the questioning was framed is prejudicial to the witnesses, and I would ask Mr. Buttigieg to reframe the question.
There is no point of order. The question was in order, and I believe the witness was about to respond to it. Please go ahead.
It's certainly been a very difficult situation, very complex law, something we've never experienced before, and I don't think many other businesses have experienced such a set of circumstances. We have done a detailed audit of what the underpayment values are, but we really do struggle with this double, what we believe is double dipping, where a certain employment group of people can receive two lots of wage adjustments in 1 year, one under the annual wage review and another one under the instrument that we have in Region 6. So we're working through that now. We do have some work going on with the Fair Work Commission to understand whether that was the intent. I'm sure it wasn't the intent that people would be getting two lots of pay rises in 1 year. So that's currently with the Fair Work Commission. We wait for their decision, and based on what the decision, that will go back to Judge Reyes, and he'll make then a decision on what payments should be made, if any.
But just correct me if I'm wrong, but hasn't Judge Reyes already ruled that, I mean, regardless of what your interpretation of the law is about pay rises, Judge Reyes has ruled, has he not, that you have underpaid your workers some $3.5 million over the 3 previous financial years. Are you disputing that fact?
Well, what I'm saying is that Judge Reyes has not handed in his final decision yet. He's waiting for information from the Fair Work Commission proceedings going there, and then we'll go back to Judge Reyes to make a decision on what that is.
But you're talking about the appeal now. I'm talking about the original decision that said that you owed your workers 3 years' worth of back pay. That's a fact, isn't it? That's on the public record. Is that not true?
I'm not familiar with that, I'm sorry, no.
You're not familiar with the decision that was made to say that you owed your workers back pay due to a misapprehension, in your words, of what you were liable to pay in terms of rises passed on by the national wage case?
When we took over Region 6, there was specified under the contract that we must abide by all of the conditions that the State Transit Authority had in those days. It was the second, I think, time that a State Transit Authority region had transitioned. We complied with that to the law. We paid the increases in December, I think, January of every year. We complied with everything that was expected of us. We weren't aware of this situation where the AWR applied for July. That's what sort of we then needed to do a lot of detailed work to understand how that was come about, because we didn't believe that was the intent of those sort of increases.
But we're not just talking about the underpayments from July, which you originally agreed to pay and then did it and then subsequently did. We're talking about the back pay over the previous 3 financial years. Now, I just want to take you to something that, these are your words, Mr. Balcon, in an email to Mr. Feuerhert, who's the managing director, I think, or the owner of the company.
Chair, can we make sure that the witness has a copy of the email provided to
I have
them?
a copy of the email.
Can we make sure that it's in front of him before we actually ask questions?
Order. To the extent that Mr. Balcon would like to have it in front of him, then we can provide that, but he may already be familiar. So if we could perhaps just allow the witness to let us know what he needs. If you could finish your question first, Mr. Buttigieg.
Thank you, Chair. Well, Mr. Balcon, you're quoted as having, in an email to Mr. Feuerhert, I think the pronunciation is, and I quote, "I think we have no alternative but to pay the increase," it's the increase you're talking about from July, "and associated back pay, and then double down on any other increases for ex-State Transit Authority drivers in the first year of the EA. Otherwise, we will have the very real possibility of being accused of wage theft, which would be extremely damaging from a reputational perspective." Are they your words, Mr. Balcon?
Without seeing the email, I can't comment.
You don't recall that email ever being published by the Financial Review?
I believe it's been published, but I haven't got it in front of me.
Is it your evidence here, Mr. Balcon, that you haven't seen that email and you know nothing about it?
I did not say that at all. I said I don't have it in front of me. I can't confirm that word by word, as you're putting it across there, is correct. I don't have it in front of me, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, I put it to you that what they were your words and that was your email, and you yourself had characterised this as potential wage theft if the company didn't make good. And now your evidence to the committee is that this is still up for an interpretation.
as I mentioned before, there is a process we're going through the Fair Work Commission to understand what the intent was for those particular wage increases, and the fact that we have complied with every payment we're required to under the Copied State Award 2018. We have complied with that. I have not been involved with the Fair Work Commission in that case there. I'm sorry.
But you employ legal counsel, don't you, Mister? You employ legal counsel to advise you on these things, and if I quote from that ruling, this is the Fair Work Act 2009, requires the panel to review minimum wages in modern awards and transitional instruments. The national minimum wage order from the previous annual wage review, the decision and order usually come into operation on 1 July of the following financial year. And I quote, the review directly affects employees in the national system, which is your copied state awards, the transitional awards, who are, one, covered by a modern award or a transitional instrument, or not covered by either an award or an agreement. So how could something like that be misinterpreted as not being a requirement to pass on those minimum rises? Isn't it the case, Mr. Balkin, that the company made a conscious decision that it wasn't going to interpret it that way and simply give the mandated rises in the transitional instrument from the copied state award? Because in your words, it's double dipping. But they were not the words
Chair,
of the judge.
The question's been asked, and then...
Sorry, is there a point of order?
I'm going to take a point of order. Mr. Buttigieg asks a question, and then he makes a further statement, then he asks another question on top of the question he's already asked, then he makes another statement, then he's asked another question. He's asked 3 questions while making 2 statements in between.
Okay, I understand.
I would ask that the witness be provided procedural fairness, and that Mr. Buttigieg ask a question, wait for a response before asking a subsequent question.
Okay, order. I uphold the point of order. If you could pause after asking your questions, Mr. Buttigieg, in order for there to be a response. Thank you.
Well, the question is very simple. How could a company of transit system size and capacity who employ legal counsel misinterpret something so explicitly defined in the Fair Work Act?
This came as a surprise to us. As I said earlier, we have complied with every part of the transitional agreement between the State Transit, New South Wales Government and ourselves. This we were advised in July 2019 by the union that when will we be paying the next increase. That is the first time we've heard of it. The union had not raised it with us for the previous 2 years or 3 years. I think they have found something that is sort of unusual, and we just wanted to test it. But we regret that it's taken 4 pay periods to pay the money, and we do regret that. And this is the first time it's ever happened to us as far as this set of circumstances. We regret it. We made that very clear in the federal court, and I think that the Judge Rare also accepted there are a very unusual set of circumstances that deal with.
But Judge Rare's also ruled that you owed, on top of the $500,000 you didn't pay your employees, which you subsequently paid for those 4 pay periods, he also ruled that in the previous 3 financial years, as a result of not abiding by the Fair Work Act, you also owed those workers, and now you're appealing that. Is that not a statement of fact?
I didn't appear in the federal court, so I can't speak exactly what was said. All I know is that Judge Rares, I understand, is waiting on a decision from the Fair Work Commission before he revisits the need and then gives orders, the decision to pay.
Well, Mr. Balkin, you're the Chief Operating Officer of Transit Systems. The bloke who's running the show, Hart, hasn't appeared, and you're telling me you don't know that there's an appeal on that $3.5 million back pay.
And I'm going to take a point of order on that one.
We have workers who have had their wages stolen,
taking a point of order,
and we can't get a straight answer on this committee.
Order. I hate to interrupt the flow. Yes, Mr. Fang.
Mr. Buttigieg has just impugned a witness who's not here by stating that...
No, I didn't. I said he didn't turn up.
Yeah.
He's not representing the company. I didn't impugn him.
Well, I
Okay,
think
order. Again, we're not talking
we have
across each
witnesses from the
other.
company. We have two witnesses, actually, in fact,
Okay.
who are here to represent the company.
This
I don't
is-
think there's any need
Mhm.
to, through procedural fairness,
Yeah,
indicate that another witness is here and impugn them by.
Okay, order. I think I've understood your point of order. We do have a procedural fairness resolution of the House that the committee secretariat can provide to any witness or to any other person who feels that they need to avail themselves of it. And there are procedures within that resolution for how you respond if you do feel that you have been unfairly impugned. Please proceed, Mr. Budwig.
Before I tie off on this line of questioning, Mr. Balkin and Mr. Sinclair, if you care to contribute, I'm more than happy for you to do so. But in that same Australian Financial Review article, which blew the lid on this caper, Mr. Feuerhardt responded, this is to your email, Mr. Balkin, and I quote, this is all on the public record, I think you know clearly my view on this, calling it a big unbudgeted blow. If attached to the agreement, I was hoping that you could at least get something for it. Reduce a penalty, get longer working hours or something, he said. Do what you need to do to avoid the court case, but I would encourage you to get the new agreement in place and leverage this as soon as you can, because it will soon enough fade in people's memories and you will end up paying even more to get the agreement over the line. What do you say to those workers who have been underpaid some $3.5 million when we've got the owner of a company making those sort of statements to try and leverage off a subsequent agreement negotiation over money that they were owed? What do you say to those workers?
I'm not going to comment on someone else's words. They're not my words, so I'm not going to comment on them. As I said before, and I'll say it again, the employees have received their increase under their instrument, Heaven Region 6, every December, January.
But I
They
think
received 2.5%.
I think you'll find justice.
Chair, the
Okay.
witness is trying to provide an answer.
Yeah.
The
Thank
deputy
you.
chair
I
is-
uphold the point of order.
Thank you.
I think you'll find, Mr.
well, I
Balkin,
think- I'm
that
not
Justice
sure.
Reyes doesn't agree with you.
I'm-
But let me move on.
Oh, please.
The federal court has also found, is this not true? Perhaps you're aware of this particular anomaly. I'm not quite sure of your level of awareness of the previous one. That Transit
Chair,
Systems
now that-
has wrongly docked the pay of
not
drivers of
appropriate.
some 250,000 during legally protected industrial action, whereby Opal card readers were turned off. We're all aware of this industrial action whereby bus drivers were turning off Opal card readers. And your company was found to have legally docked their pay $250,000. Is that correct or not?
There was an assessment made on what the value of that non-compliance, as far as what the percentage of the work day is. We relied on some information from a previous case in Australia. We applied that same sort of philosophy. It was found to be incorrect. We adjusted it as soon as we were made aware of it to the agreed level of deduction.
Given the time, and this line of questions has been going for quite a while, I will just interrupt now to ask a few questions. Sure. And we'll come back. Sure. I would like to ask Mr. Rowe a few questions, if I could. You've been sitting there very patiently. A few questions. I guess, in your opening statement, you said that words to the effect that privatised services can be quite effective, or that services run by private corporations can be quite effective. Busways is a family business. Obviously, not all corporations are created equally. What do you think it is about Busways that perhaps distinguishes you from your competitors in terms of being able to provide what I'm sure, in your opinion, is a better service?
I think my comment was probably more around that private operators overall can generally provide a more efficient service than a government can, and this is not something certainly unique to the bus industry. A private business has arguably stronger leadership, more decisiveness, and that ultimately allows them to make the hard decisions needed to operate efficiently.
So is your evidence then that all private operators would provide a more efficient and better service, or does it depend on the way that that private operator is behaving?
Look, I certainly can't speak for all private operators, but certainly many of the larger, more capable private operators would be able to deliver a more efficient service than governments can.
Do you believe then that Busways is a better provider of bus services than your competitors?
I would hope so, and that is why we won the contract.
And so I guess what I'm asking is, why is that? Compared to your competitors, why do you believe that you create a more effective and efficient service?
We obviously weren't privy to the assessment of the tender, but we certainly would guess that it is around our ability to deliver the services more cost efficiently, and that we have convinced the government that we can operate them to a higher quality.
Okay, so I know that you talked about cost, which obviously is the cost to the government. In terms of the customer experience, what is it, do you think, specifically, that makes Busways a better provider of services to a customer than your competitors?
Sure. So I think I often describe our industry as sort of the sum of lots of little things that equal a quality experience. So often it's little things like the presentation of the buses, how we deal with the graffiti and how we dedicate resources to that, the timeliness of the services, our driver training, how we work with governments to design better bus networks that are more usable to our people. So there's lots and lots of little things that we do to, I guess, provide an overall better experience. Engagement with councils and working with councils on improving infrastructure, on fixing potholes, on providing better bus stop infrastructure.
So when we look at the picture of privatisation of all the bus regions in the Greater Sydney area, there's, as far as I know, no overlap between provider and I guess one provider having an overlapping, having two regions which sort of are adjacent to each other. So we have this picture where we have, and apologies I don't have it in my folder, or I would be able to describe it better, but say there's 7 regions or 9 regions. There are different providers all adjacent to each other in that structure. Do you think that there would be efficiencies, or what opportunities would there be for Busways to provide a better customer service if you had 2 adjacent regions rather than being surrounded by competitor bus operators?
Sure. So I would say the first thing is that the map is a little bit arbitrary. The reality is that contracts are made up based on a group of routes, and many of those routes will go across the little borders around a contract that's written on a map. And across the years, there certainly hasn't been necessarily a lot of thought as to which route should belong into which contract. In terms of the opportunity, I guess, if an operator was to operate 2 adjacent contracts, it's probably more around the efficiency that an operator could derive by scheduling those contracts together as a whole rather than individually. From a customer service perspective, I don't think there's any increased ability. I think an operator can operate any standalone contract to a high level, whether that's standalone and surrounded by other operators or whether they also operate the adjacent contract.
So by extension then, if you were to have 3 regions or 4 regions, there could be those greater efficiencies of putting those contracts together. Is that what you're saying?
That's right, and that's something that Transport for New South Wales has contemplated, and they are the ones dictating which regions could potentially be combined together and which ones are unable to be combined together.
which begs the question then as to how a bus network that has so many different operators holding so many different segments could be as efficient as a one bus region or one sort of commonly owned bus region, say by the government. Your evidence before was that these things are always better run by a private company, and yet you're also now saying that if one entity is to hold all of those regions, then it would naturally be a more efficient service. So how do those two things fit together?
I guess that I would say that is one aspect of efficiency, and that efficiency may come about or it may not come about depending on where depots are located and specifically which routes there are. But in terms of being able to provide a contract as efficiently as possible, there's many factors at play, and particularly around an operator's ability to schedule those services. That varies significantly between operator to operator and certainly to the previous State Transit Authority.
Is there any benefit to the government in having outsourced the bus services to so many different providers as opposed to just one provider?
Yes, absolutely. Having the entire city operated potentially by one operator makes it very hard to go to market and find another operator. There's no competitive tension. There's no market, and I think what's needed, and certainly the approach that's taken by almost every city around the world, is a mix of several operators to operate the contracts.
There's no competition within each region, is there? So it's not like so I understand that there's a competition in terms of people competing for government contracts.
Correct.
But in terms of users of services being able to sort of choose between providers, it's not like if you're living in Waverley, you can say, well, this service is rubbish, I'm going to use this one instead. There's no competition at the user level, is there?
No, there's not. And that's the way that our contracts work, where as a government contractor, we don't derive our revenue from the fare box. And so there is no competition between operators.
So if you're not held accountable through people choosing to use somebody else, what ways are you held accountable for your service? By the customer, not by the government.
Our contract has lots of sticks and carrots, if you like. We have very stringent KPIs around on-time running and cancelled trips, presentation of our vehicles, major defects, minor defects, all those sorts of things to ensure that we're doing a good job.
How long does your contract run for?
There's different, we operate a number of different types of contracts that have different lengths. Typically, they are between 5 and 8 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Region 7 would expire 28, something like that?
Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Chair, do you mind if I ask
Please.
a few questions? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rowe, for coming in today and providing the insights to the committee from the private bus operators, which I think is really important given that there's been some perhaps one-sided testimony to date. In the last inquiry, one of the last hearings, apologies, I spoke about the fact that I'm from Wagga and we've got private bus operators there, but that private bus operation allows, I guess, the operator to know their customers, and the sort of the family operation that was there before allows that closer connection. Is that the experience you found with, I guess, your family-operated company, that you've got perhaps a closer connection to your customers?
Look, I think that's something that comes with how long you've been operating in an area for. And certainly the longer you've been operating in an area, the more that you've been able to sort of understand the community and what the community values and doesn't value. You've been able to build up those relationships with local council and local community groups. So it's probably more associated with tenure, and in the areas where we've operated for a very, very long time, like in Western Sydney for 80 years, is certainly something that we would like to think that we have a deep understanding of. And it's certainly, as we move into and move into a new area and a new contract, that's something that we look to learn and develop.
And with the I guess, engagement you have with your workforce, given that you are a family-run company, do you find that in a lot of ways you probably have a closer connection to your employees than perhaps what there might have been through a government-run bureaucracy-type transport organisation?
Look, I would like to think so. Certainly family values and caring about our people is part of our core values and something that we invest in heavily. Having said that, I think, from what I've seen, compared to potentially some of our competitors, the SCA did certainly value their staff, and it's not something that they were terrible at.
It's not what I'm suggesting at all. I'm just trying to get a picture of how private operations perhaps might differ from a more bureaucratic government-led organisation. You spoke about the bus, system being a sum of many small parts, and I know you've already had questions today about how is it that a private bus operator could be more efficient than perhaps, say, a government-run organisation. Is it perhaps that a number of the small things that come about from a private bus operator, like you said, it might be the appearance of the buses and the way that things are done that you might do in your organisation that might lead to efficiencies is part of how that efficiency comes, and that it's the fact that you've actually done things for a long time but perhaps do them in a different way is how those efficiencies can be gained for the government.
Probably not. I would say our efficiencies largely come from two things. The first is how we schedule our services. So it's actually much more complicated than people think about how to build an efficient shift and an efficient roster. We have very complex software, and we have a very large team to look at actually how to link everything together as efficiently as possible. And the difference between an efficient, a set of efficient shifts and an efficient roster compared to an inefficient one can actually be enormous, despite providing the exact same services to the public. So we're talking about all of the dead time, if you like, and how efficiently we can deal with that time. So there's that bucket. The other bucket would just be in our overhead components and how we're able to leverage that and operate on a lean model.
So in your opinion then, the public is unlikely to see on face value the difference between a public operator and a private operator. Would that be fair?
From an efficiency perspective, I would certainly like to think that from a quality perspective that we were able to deliver more reliable, cleaner, better maintained services.
Yeah. And I know that you were asked questions about the need for a competitive nature in the, contractual arrangements that are existing between the different regions. And I guess there's one view that if a single operator perhaps operated all the regions, that there might be efficiencies that are gained there. Could you talk a little bit about the risk that might happen if a single operator was given those all the regions, and other operators were perhaps, I'll say starved, but not provided an opportunity to have a component of that? What that would do to the other operators come a future contract time, and what competitive position the other operators might be in order to be able to provide value for money for the government?
So I'll answer that by going all the way back to 2012 and 2013, which is the first time that private operators were put to tender in Sydney. And there were a number of private operators who were small family businesses who only operated maybe one contract, and when they lost that contract, their business disappeared. And so you could imagine that if Sydney was operated by a single contract, that we would have private operators disappear, and certainly that would be something that would take away from the competitiveness of the market. To answer the other side of your question around risk, one of the key things that comes to mind, and on the theme of industrial relations, is if you could imagine if the entire bus workforce fell under a single enterprise agreement, and if there was industrial action for that enterprise agreement, we could end up in a situation like we've just had with Sydney Trains, where the entire bus network across the city could stop overnight, which would be extremely damaging. That's certainly one of the things that there could be others.
So, in your experience, is the mix that currently exists of a number of different private operators operating the regions, does it provide a reliable service to the government and the population? Does it provide value for money for the government? And does it provide a leveraging of risk that the government carries on a number of issues, i.e., like you said, industrial relations, the ability to have competitive tendering, and the provision of services across a wide area?
I think that without a doubt, some operators are more efficient than others, and some operators certainly can deliver high quality service than others. And that's always going to be the case. I guess the question is, from a taxpayer or a government perspective, is are all of the operators meeting sort of the minimum expectations or the minimum thresholds that we set? And I would certainly say that there is opportunity to improve, and for some operators to perform better.
Order. So Mr. Rath has a question, and then I'll go back to Mr. Badagi.
Sure. Mr. Balkan and Mr. Sinclair, I just wanted to ask you a question about the customer experience. I think you run regions 3 and 6, is Western Sydney and the Inner West. What has been the customer experience in these regions that you operate, and how would you say it differs to when the STA used to run those regions?
Look, I'll kick that one off. Certainly, our customer satisfaction from independent surveys, whether it be from Transport for New South Wales, has shown an 8% increase since we took over. We also undertake our own mystery shopper surveys. Independent company gets on our buses and speaks to customers independently. We've got an increase from 86% when we first started to 93.5% in December 2021. So there's certainly been an increase in customer satisfaction, a reduction in customer complaints of 40% when we started on the 1st of July 2018. We place a lot of emphasis on our customer service to our employees, training packages, our training. We have very good and skilled and experienced trainers. So we place a lot of emphasis on our customer service. But it's not one part. It's a bit like Byron may have said before. It's made up of a lot of parts. A good customer service outcome is improved reliability. It includes more stops, frequent stops. We've increased from express services. We've introduced new services, additional trips. So it is really a big package. Putting it all together is where you get an improvement in your customer service. It's not just one bit. It is the driver behaviour, it's the fleet vehicle presentation, it's the performance of the management team. It is a big bundle, and as I said, since July 1, 2018, we certainly have improved in all those areas, in both Region 3 and Region 6.
Thank you.
Mr. Badagi.
Thanks, Chair. I might just quickly go to Mr. Rowe on on a related subject, given that we were on it before. So since taking over, I think in January 2022, has Busways delivered the timetable as designed without any cancellations?
Certainly not without any cancellations, but I would like to think as few cancellations as possible. We actually took over...
Sorry, you would like to think. Do you have any sense of proportion there?
Well, the interesting thing about when we took over is that we were in the middle of a lockdown. And so due to driver unavailability, we actually commenced the contract operating a Saturday timetable, even on a weekday. And this is something that was happening all across Sydney with most operators. So if you sort of, it's a little bit difficult because we didn't take over that contract in normal circumstances.
Okay. I might just go back to some of these industrial relations practices, and there's some related line of questioning I'd like to pursue with you, Mr. Rowe, but back to transit systems. Mr. Balcon or Mr. Sinclair, happy for either of you to take this, but is it not a fact that in the contract specification from Transport for New South Wales, the signatory to the contract must be the employing entity of drivers as well? Is that a fair enough interpretation? Are you still with us?
Just contemplating your question.
Yeah.
You take that on notice. Question on notice. We'll come back to you on that.
You take it on notice. Okay. Well, can I ask you then, why did Transit Systems set up a corporate structure which involved a sub-company under the structure called Transit New South Wales Service Proprietary Limited to employ any new drivers? Why not just use the entity known as Transit Systems West Services, which employed all the legacy drivers from State Transit Authority? Why set up that corporate structure?
Bit of history behind the transition. When we took over, when we awarded the contract, State Transit Authority in Region 6 was about 200 drivers short. They'd been in that situation for years, we understand. So we needed to recruit as many drivers as we could. We needed to start recruiting from February for a July start. We recruited 159 drivers. We had to train them. A lot of them were new to the industry. We had to train them in Region 3 on bus services, customer service and the like, to be able to commence on the 1st of July 2018. To supplement that shortfall, we brought 52 drivers in from Perth who were duly accredited just to run the services that State Transit hadn't done for years. We were in fact getting people ringing us and saying, there's a bus in my street today on a Sunday. I haven't seen a bus in my street for years. What's it doing there? Well, guess what? We're actually providing services that were timetable. The only way we could recruit people in that situation, we couldn't even recruit them under the other arrangement because it wasn't in place at the time. This was about February 2018. Dan might have some more comment on that.
No, that's right. So with the service commencement on the 1st of July 2018, prior to that, we had to employ them during that other group, as Greg explained. And we had people working out of our Hoxton Park and Smithfield depots as Region 3, ready to commence work on July 1, 18 in Region 6.
Yes, but what prevented you from using that existing entity to employ those new people? I'm not quite sure what the purpose of the second entity was. Was it impossible for you to employ that extra labour under that existing corporate entity? In other words, Transit Systems West Services Proprietary Limited? So you got this group of STA people who were...
Now that the chair's back, I'm going to take a point of order because that's exactly what I had raised a point of order about before, which is Mr. Buttigieg asks a question, and then as the witnesses are about to answer, he then starts to make a statement.
There's a word called elaboration.
Okay, order.
Well, you ask a question and then you get a
I have
response.
heard enough. For the benefit of Hansard, if we could do question, answer. If you could just pause before... yes, just so you can allow the response. Thank you.
So the question is very simple and straightforward. You had a corporate entity known as Transit Systems West Services. Why not use that to employ everyone, old and new?
Because I don't think we can employ new employees under that agreement.
Sorry, you don't think, or you're sure?
I did not set up the corporate structure. I cannot comment any further than that.
Well-
And to take on notice if you wish to have some more detail, I don't want to make a comment that is incorrect. Prefer to get the details to you.
Okay, so you don't know if your own company can employ everyone on under that same corporate structure. So can I put it to you that as a result of the creation of Transit New South Wales Service Proprietary Limited, and we heard this on evidence, that those drivers coming in under that entity are actually getting paid less and are on worse conditions? Did you accept that evidence that you presumably would have gone over before coming here
No, I don't
today?
accept that at all. Jamie will make a comment, but I'll make a comment firstly. If you look purely at an hourly rate of pay, you would see that there is a lesser hourly rate of pay. There are other provisions within the TWU type of agreement that actually increases the take-home pay, such as certain penalty rates. There's a $16 driver conductor allowance per day for carrying fare-paying passengers. There's a lot of other things you need to put into the mix to see what the actual take-home pay is. And I acknowledge that I worked for State Transit for 18 years. I know how State Transit works. I'm fully aware of how private enterprise works. There's a lot of inefficiencies in the State Transit operational profile. There's conditions in there that aren't seen anywhere else in New South Wales in the private sector, like 5 weeks annual leave, ADOs and the like. We're working very well with the unions now on the EA negotiations. We had a rocky start, but we're looking really good now, and we're working well with both unions. It's a very difficult situation.
But sorry, Mr. Balcon, on that point, isn't there the TWU and the RTB are on a unity ticket on this, and there's a common instrument that they're trying to get the bus companies to sign on to equalise these paying conditions? But my understanding is transit systems want nothing to do with it. Are you saying you've changed your position?
We've been working through a process for several months now, and we cannot see that some of the conditions of the STA drivers should be replicated across all of the industries. We're talking about all other bus drivers in Region 3, and that will then go through all the other
Okay, so that's a very clear and straight answer. Your position is that they shouldn't be the same. They should be on different rates of pay and different conditions.
Chair, sorry, I just wanted to ask a clarifying question on that point, if that's all right. A very brief one.
Is this an order?
No, I'm just asking a clarifying question, if that's all right.
Had you finished?
Can I?
Sorry.
I was simply asking.
He's
Mr.
asked a
Balcon
question.
to
We're now
clarify
waiting for an answer.
that interpretation.
Oh, okay.
My view is that we're working very well with the unions, both the TWU and the RTBU, on getting a good set of conditions that can coexist, and we look forward to having. It's not easy for us to have to roster different on different parameters.
Can I just ask that clarifying question now, if that's all right, Chair?
Yeah.
The second question is, we look forward to concluding our negotiations with the unions.
Mr. Balcon, can I just ask quickly?
To that, if I could. Your question about the salaries. As a snapshot for the last financial year, we took the top 10 earners for Region 6, and of those top 10, seven of those are new employees. Without going into the detail, admittedly, Greg mentioned there are different shift penalties and different shift lengths.
Well, there's different hours work too, presumably.
I take the point. I just
It's
said
a
without
minor
going into detail.
technicality, yeah.
Can I just ask, gentlemen, did the workers that are on the separate arrangements, did they accept those jobs?
Yes, I did.
Thank you.
So just to follow up to that, the workers on the different arrangements mean the ones on the second tier accepted those jobs.
I don't believe it was, I'll take a point of order, I don't believe it was referred to as a second tier at any point in any testimony, Chair.
Let's just move on to Mr. Rowe, because I think there's a similar sort of setup with busways in terms of the two-tier workplace arrangement in Region 7. Did you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I think it's fair if the Deputy Chair perhaps explains what he determines is a two-tier system.
Okay.
The busways tend to propose
All right. Order.
two-tier
Sorry, we are
workplace.
almost through this particular session. If I could just remind the witnesses that if they feel that they need clarification on any questions, that they should feel free to ask. In the meantime, we could refrain from interjections. Please go ahead, Mr. Buttigieg.
Well, did the busways tender propose a two-tier workplace? In other words, two separate agreements.
Yes, it proposed two separate agreements. I would not necessarily refer to it as a two-tier workplace.
Okay. Well, let's call it two separate agreements. And
Let's do that.
What was the reason for that? What were the implications for that?
The reasons were, just like Greg has said, was that the STA award has many highly inefficient conditions, and those conditions are not standard across the private industry. And in many cases, those conditions are not actually benefiting those workers in any way. So our approach was that the existing STA workforce would transition across on their copy state award and of course retain all of their terms and conditions. And any new employees would be employed on a different agreement which enabled us to schedule the services more efficiently.
And your interpretation of the contractual requirement from Transport for New South Wales for the signatory to the contract to be the direct employer?
Our entity certainly is the direct employer of all employees.
Yes.
It is possible to have multiple enterprise agreements.
Okay,
under
so
a single
Transport for
entity.
New South Wales, in your view, designed that so that you could undercut the workforce if you wanted to.
I certainly wouldn't describe it as undercutting.
Okay. I just want to go to another line. How much time?
I think we've actually run out of time, Chair.
We have one more question.
I just wanted to get your view on the Transport for New South Wales says that it is not the provider, and I'll quote Minister Elliott, the New South Wales government both doesn't have a role in the provision of private bus services and doesn't hold the purse strings. But given that they specify the routes, they specify the bus stops, they give you the KPIs, they own all the assets, is that a misleading statement to say that Transport for New South Wales has nothing to do with the private bus routes? I mean, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You've either outsourced it and it's all on the private operators, or you own the assets and you dictate the routes and the service provision. Which one is it from your perspective?
Transport for New South Wales effectively designs the contract and what is to be delivered under that contract. Private operators then bid at tender and determine how much that will cost them to operate. And so it is really up to the private operators to determine how much it will cost to deliver those services or not. Of course, Transport for New South Wales, in having control over how many services and what they look like, have control over.
And the amount of money dedicated to each tender.
No, they don't have control over the amount of money dedicated to each tender. It is up to the operators tendering to put their price forward.
Okay, that brings us to the end of this session. I'd like to thank our witnesses very much for attending. To the extent there were questions taken on notice, or if there are supplementary questions, you'll have 21 days to respond with your answers, but the committee team will be in touch in relation to that. We will take a brief tea break and be back at 11:30. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Welcome back. I will now welcome our next panel of witnesses. Thank you very much for attending today. I'll start by asking each of you to state your name and position title, and then swear either the oath or the affirmation. I'll start with you, Mr. Porter.
Okay, my name's Christian Porter. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer of Keolis Downer. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you, Mr. Dunlop.
Mark Dunlop, Managing Director, Northern Beaches. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you, and Ms. Griffiths.
Hi there, I'm Leanne Griffiths from Red Bus Services on the Central Coast, and I will take the oath. I swear that the evidence now about to given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you very much. I'll now invite you to make a short opening statement, if you like. Is that you, Mr. Porter?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. Keolis Downer is one of Australia's leading operators of public transport. Every year we deliver 350 million passenger journeys. We have an especially strong commitment to public transport in New South Wales, where we employ 1,000 people in 2 contract areas and carry more than 37 million passengers every year. Our services include Newcastle Transport, which is Australia's first multimodal contract to be delegated to a private operator. We also provide bus services on the Northern Beaches and Lower North Shore, where we have mobilised well and are providing consistent and reliable transport across the bus network from Palm Beach to the CBD. Ownership of the assets, including buses and depots in these 2 regions, remains in public hands, and our role is to be the steward of these assets during the term. In the New South Wales model, government makes the decisions about routes, timetables and bus stops. Prior to the recent procurement processes, Transport for New South Wales released Network 2020, which is a service plan that we currently operate. With regard to fares, IPART sets all the fares. Within the Northern Beaches contract, we also operate the highly innovative Kia Ride on-demand services that help more than 20,000 passengers a month to reach their destination in a safe and timely manner. As an organisation, we are incredibly proud of what we do and believe we have delivered for passengers, taxpayers and our team. In terms of driving innovation in service delivery, we will be introducing 125 electric buses to the Northern Beaches over the next 7 years. We also have 3 coming into Newcastle. Thank you, and I look forward to helping you with your inquiries today.
Thank you. Ms. Griffiths?
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this hearing. Red Bus Services is one of the oldest family-operated bus companies in New South Wales, operating on the Central Coast for over 80 years and then up on the North Coast before that. From a humble beginnings, Red Bus has grown to become a major bus company on the Central Coast, employing 160 Central Coast residents and operating a fleet of 106 contract buses to service the Outer Sydney Metropolitan Bus Service contract known as Region 7. Red Bus Company's mission has always been to be the bus operator of choice and employer of choice. We harvest this mission by living in our community, collaborating with government and treating every employee as a member of the family. We believe and understand that privatisation and tendering are here to stay, but what must be guaranteed for people of New South Wales is transparency and a level of assurance that the decision of the procurement team when awarding bus contracts is in the best interest of the local communities that the bus operator is to serve and not driven by bureaucracy. For example, the desire of Transport New South Wales to amalgamate bus contracts can only be the right decision if it will provide better customer outcomes for those communities, not because it will reduce costs in the initial round of tendering. The bus contracts must also drive customer outcomes and not technology outcomes. Transport for New South Wales are so focused on technology that customer is sometimes sacrificed so the technology can work. The recent floods is a great example. If you're a bus operator who is technology and KPI driven, you would consider whether to cancel trips, as the KPI penalty is lower for a cancelled trip than it is for diverting the bus and running late. So also the bus tracking technology is unable to cope with diversions. It prefers you to cancel the trips. How is this to help the customer? I have accepted this invitation to appear before this committee to hopefully assist in this inquiry, and I'm happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will start with the opposition. Mr. Buttigieg.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you all for taking the time out to appear before the hearing. It's much appreciated. Perhaps to Keolis Downer first. We heard on evidence when we had the Hunter MPs in here who are in your sort of catchment area that they all raised concerns about a local disability employer, Access Industries, not being consulted prior to the 2018 network changes. Can you tell us what the issue there was with that failure to consult?
Mark, do you want to take that?
Certainly, consultation occurred with all stakeholders within Newcastle. It was before I commenced operations up there. I had personally met with Access Industries, including the 3 local politicians, and talked through any issues. We also work very closely with House with No Steps. I think they've changed their name now to Aroomba. We work with them. One of the initiatives of Keolis Downer is we always bring in customer service officers that again are on the ground working with any of our passengers to make sure that we demystify how to move through the network to the best of their ability.
So just to clarify, because it's quite contradictory evidence, so this is prior to the 2018 network changes. They're saying that Access Industries weren't consulted. Are you saying they were?
I cannot comment prior to 2018. Certainly, I joined Newcastle 2018 at the launch of the network. The planning had been done prior to my commencement there, and I personally met with Access Industries.
Okay. Mr. Port, do you have any insights into this?
No, if we missed them, we apologise. We do have a commitment to meet with as wide a group of stakeholders as we can before any service change.
Okay. In terms of the broader consultation across Newcastle and the Hunter regarding the community's expected levels of service, KPIs and the design of the network, given the number of complaints about service quality since privatisation of the network in 2017-18, could you just elaborate on how you exactly consult with the communities? We heard on evidence this morning from the Eastern Suburbs routes and some of those companies that were running there that local council aren't really in on the equation at all, and no one seems to know how the consultation process works and what the feedback mechanism is.
I'll take it. Oh, sorry, before I'm going to take a point of order. That is not the evidence that was given by the bus companies. In fact, the bus company said that they deliberately speak with the council. So to say that
I was referring to evidence
order.
of the council.
Yes,
Order.
that is correct.
Order. Mr. Fang.
Okay, apologies.
When we take a point of order, if we could make it as quick as possible, and rather than it being some sort of discussion across the table, to the extent that evidence needs to be clarified, the witnesses are reminded they can clarify that evidence in their answers. If we could proceed without as much interruption, please go ahead, Mr. Buttigieg.
Well, to be specific, the evidence from Waverley Council was that council is not consulted and they're unaware of the mechanisms for consulting the public. Can you elaborate on what Keolis Downer's methodology is for consulting the public?
Okay, so I can't speak for Waverley Council and Region 9. I can talk to Region 8 and Newcastle. In Region 8, where we operate the services in Northern Beaches Council area, Mark and I both meet with Council every fortnight for an hour. We take them through our planning, where we're going. We understand all of the urban activation that's happening across the city and where we can put our services to better suit what the council initiatives are. There was a second part to your question, though. It was around Newcastle at the start.
Well, no, I was just referring to the services in the Newcastle region. And so that consultation with council, is that direct meetings or via a traffic committee? Or
No, direct meetings.
Yeah. And in terms of with the public directly,
So,
how do the public communicate what if there's any issues with the services?
yeah, when we took over Northern Beaches, again I'll talk to Northern Beaches because it's the most current one, we brought in a customer service team which wasn't there prior. That includes 8 customer service officers that operate the network. They're also available in the depots. We also have website and all of the general communication forums that allow people to either come directly to us or come through transport or come through council towards us.
Okay. Can I ask you why the changes to the Hunters bus services implemented by Transport for New South Wales and Keolis Downer include the removal of all direct connections to Charlestown, Newcastle CBD and Morisset train station?
Mark, you're a bit closer to the detail in Newcastle.
Yeah, certainly when looking at any network planning, you're dealing with a finite resource number of buses. Certainly the direct services from Swansea to Charlestown exist, and when you look at the points where people are travelling on, there's really two. Most people go from Swansea to Charlestown and then to John Hunter Hospital, which is also a teaching hospital, and then to University of Newcastle at Callaghan. So bringing the high frequency routes, which there's 4 of, and providing opportunities. Most people, certainly from Swansea, Charlestown is their primary focus, followed by John Hunter, followed by University of Newcastle. Recently, you may be aware there has been some additional services put in at 10X that will operate from Charlestown directly into Newcastle CBD. But again, the high frequency services, trunk routes that are operating every 15 minutes are the main backbone to the network based on finite resources.
So that's very important and relevant evidence because it's consistent with some of the implications we drew from this morning's evidence. That is that inevitably a private operator will have to, and it's not your fault, right? You've got a profit motive, you've got to turn a profit, you've got to pay wages already, but inevitably you will have to rationalise some routes based on evidence, Opal card reads, whatever, that here is where the density of traffic is, and inevitably some of those radial services that might otherwise have been cross-subsidised, by a public service, get cut loose. So it's not, I'm not making a judgment about you as entities because you're in the business of making money, but that's the reality, isn't it?
I'm not sure those 2 points are connected, Mr. Buddy. So if you think about what's been happening in Newcastle, and the city's been going through urban revitalisation probably since 2015, when you look at the city, there was a dramatic change in University of Newcastle investing in 2 CBD campuses. One of the things we were looking at doing at the time of bidding, and Mark as Managing Director of Newcastle continued on post-bid, we started to work through how would we drive more people to public transport. And one of the big things we see in driving more people towards public transport is this concept of turn up and go, or frequency on the network. So as Mark said, you pick a couple of routes that you know are really high frequency, you increase the frequency on that service so people can go there with greater certainty of a bus coming in 10 or 15 minutes. That doesn't naturally tie to rationalising other services, but there are a finite number of buses and a finite number of bus drivers that can service the route. So,
but hang on a minute, aren't the two connected? Because you're saying it's not necessarily connected, but what I'm hearing is that it is, because there's a finite amount of buses and services, therefore something must be cut. Isn't that what we're really saying?
This comes down to the complex art of scheduling, and without taking away all services where they're in the outer areas and less patronised, you try and reallocate the buses. Keeping in mind in Newcastle we also brought on an on-demand service, and the on-demand service has a greater reach than what a route bus service would have.
Sorry, if I'll just interrupt here. Well, I guess one of the concerns that's been raised with us during the hearings in relation to a privatised model of bus delivery or bus service delivery is the customers being one step removed from who is ultimately accountable for the service. So previously, when we had public services, publicly run buses, if there was a problem that a resident had or that a worker had, they could go straight to the government to make that complaint. Whereas now the government sort of wipes their hands and says, well, no, that's not for us. That is something that the private operator needs to deal with. But then the private operators seem to be saying, well, actually, no, we're kind of governed by the contract. Do you see, from a business perspective, do you see that tension playing out?
Yeah, not in the way that you've outlined, Chair. So I can't talk for all bus operators, I'll only talk for our operation. We have a rigorous set of KPIs of which customer satisfaction is key. Some of those metrics are operated by ourselves in terms of fielding customer feedback. Others are done specifically by Transport for New South Wales.
And when workers go on strike, does that impact on your KPIs?
100%.
So I understand today it was announced that the bus drivers in Newcastle will be going on strike on Friday. What is the, I guess, who are you blaming for that? Is that something that that will be a something that will impact on your, if it doesn't impact on your KPIs, we're looking to the government to solve that? Is that, how has this arisen?
We don't look to blame anybody. We rely on our relationship with the workforce to deliver the services.
Yeah.
And with the workforce, we're currently going through an EBA negotiation, and the concept of taking protected action is something well within the rights of the workforce to do. If we do cancel trips, then it comes back to us as the operator.
And so when you're negotiating with your drivers, to what extent are you limited by the contract you have with government?
So the contract we have has indices for wage price indexation. At the moment, cost of living pressures are pushing the expectations much higher than WPI, so we have to manage the delta between the two.
So it is in your discretion then as to what to pay your drivers. It's not, this can't be blamed on the government. This is something that the drivers should be looking to you for.
We've got a working relationship with our drivers, and we have to ensure that the practice of conditions and terms and conditions, so conditions being around pay, terms and conditions about their policies at work, are all in place so that they're happy to come and drive for us on a daily basis. So we don't shirk that responsibility.
So as you know, unions don't strike just at the drop of a hat. This is something that happens after a period of negotiation, and when they feel that they have order, when they feel they have no other option. This is quite an extreme move, and evidences that the negotiations have not been going well. But it's your evidence here today that this is something that is not being, I guess, hindered by the government, but is purely within your control.
We're working with our workers' representatives and our workforce to come to an EBA for the next 3 years that's agreeable to all parties.
Okay, so the public, when they have no services on Friday, they're to blame you and not the government, is that correct?
How about they blame the drivers?
The unions.
I don't think you understand how unions work. Please go ahead. Answer the question.
Actually, that's true.
Point of order, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. I hear the point of order.
We hear constant interference being run by the government, and when they're asking questions, no one runs interference. I ask you to call them to order.
Thank you. I called the point of order, and I did call them to order. If we could stop the interjections, please. I don't think that they are particularly helpful. The question was that when the people of Newcastle are without bus services on Friday, are they to blame you and your management or the government?
We'll work as hard as we can with our workforce to try and ensure that the protected action doesn't go through. If it does, all we'll do is what we can do to try and deliver those services on the Friday.
Right, so just to clarify then, they should blame you.
I would hope they don't blame anyone. They see that we're working hard to get to an agreement.
I will allow Mr. Tang to
thank you.
and ask
Chair.
a question.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for coming in today and providing some very valuable evidence to us. I wanted to take this opportunity to clear up some, I'd say, misinformation in the first instance. Is it true that you are paid, in effect, like a per kilometre rate through your contract, i.e. if you had a bus with nobody on it and you still ran that bus service, you would be paid. It's not about whether you have somebody on that bus paying for their fee. You get paid to operate that service no matter what.
That's correct. We're not governed by the fare box. We deliver the services as per the approved service plan.
Right. So this idea that's sort of being promulgated throughout this inquiry that somehow it's the operators and their cutting of services, for financial benefit to yourselves is probably undermined by the fact that you get paid whether you have a full bus or nobody on that bus at all.
That's right. We try to deliver the best level of customer service we can on the service plan that's been agreed with the state.
Yeah. And as you earlier said, where there are changes to the network and the routes that are operating, that's in order to perhaps provide the more popular routes with increased frequency of buses, increased ability to, what was the term you used? I think arrive and go,
Up and go.
Yeah, up and go. The flexibility of perhaps removing some of those less patronised routes or no patronised routes, and then supporting those other things is about providing a better customer experience for the bulk of customers. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Mark talked before about the use of finite resources. It's in our interests as Keolis Downer, but that too of the industry, to drive modal shift to public transport. We really want to give people the services they want to use, where they want to use them at the time they want to use them.
Yeah.
So Keolis Downer is a very large organisation. We have proprietary tools to look at network analysis, customer feedback, working with various stakeholders to try and provide ideas to transport of where those services could be best placed.
Ms Griffith, is it the same for your organisation as well?
Yeah, yes it is, but ultimately transport manages the bus services, the routes, the timetables and the bus stops. What we do is we actively do the same as Keolis, where we look at our data and we review and we constantly give new ideas. But we also appreciate that the government only has a limited amount of funds. So you can't always service everybody. But we do our best to try and meet everybody's wishes, as we understand that our services are sometimes the only way people can get around.
So do you think it's fair to say that you're using the data that you have through your patronage and local knowledge and experience of providing that service, you're taking that to Transport for New South Wales and providing it with perhaps some experience and suggested solutions, and between the two of you, you're coming up with hopefully the ability to provide better services to the bulk of the customers in your routes. Would that be fair for both organisations?
That is correct. And also when we do network reviews, we listen to the community and we ask them what they actually would like. But you can't always please all community members, but you do your best.
Yep.
And you look at what type of community members require it the most as well. So you take into consideration that there are people out there who require our services to get to hospitals,
yep.
Get to shopping centres, get to universities. So all that is taken into consideration, and ultimately transport makes the decision.
Yep.
Can I ask?
I've got two more questions, Jeff. That's all
Okay,
right.
two more.
Thank you, Chair. It's very generous of you. It's not even your birthday. And
You interrupted me, but go on. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just assume that it's the same for your organisation as well.
Yeah.
And
Really fulsome answer from you.
and I thank you for that. So when you're developing that, you actually do consult with, affected stakeholders. So the premise that's been promulgated again, that there's no consultation that's undergone. Would that be unfair, do you think?
Do you want me to take this one first, Leanne?
Okay, yeah.
So the only reason I'm taking this one before Leanne is we've been involved in tender processes a little bit more recently, but as part of the evaluation, we have to develop customer experience plans. We have to develop stakeholder management plans. We are absolutely evaluated on those and required to keep them in place throughout the term of the contract.
Yeah, and so that's unfair. You think it's unfair the way that it's been characterised in this inquiry? Would that be?
Look, I think we have a responsibility to the communities in which we work, that we consult widely.
Yeah.
We do apologise if we missed a key stakeholder, but it's absolutely within our interest to talk to as many people as we can.
Okay. I've got one final question, but if you wanted to have any...
I just wanted to say from my example is I also live in the community. So if we do something wrong, someone's going to let me know at a football ground or a shopping centre. So, it's really important you get it right.
Yeah.
And having community and local knowledge makes a difference.
Yeah,
and that's why a company like ours is 80 years old and gets 98% customer satisfaction, because we listen to our community.
Right. And the final question I wanted to put before I come back, if we have some more time, is in relation to the strike that's happening on Friday, is it fair to say that the contract that you have has an indexed amount of perhaps wage rises built into the contract? What your workforce is seeking is a higher than that amount. Therefore, that's where I guess the pressure is that if that was to be accepted by your company, it would be off your company's, it'd be your company that would have to make the difference up. Would be a fair thing? So just having got those parameters.
Yeah, it's reduced profit, Wes. Come on, move on.
I think
that was actually
Okay,
unfair.
order.
The question I was going to ask was
Order. If we could just proceed in an orderly manner without intervening. If we want to make a point of order. Order. The chair is speaking.
Sorry.
If there's a point of order to be taken, please say point of order. Otherwise, stop interjecting.
Thank you.
Please continue.
If your company is forced to operate where it perhaps makes a loss, how long do you think you'd be able to operate for? And what would happen to your drivers and the services in your community should you not be able to continue providing that service?
So I think the best way for me to answer your question, Mr. Fang, is the negotiations we have with our workforce. They're commercially sensitive. We hugely respect our workforce and their representatives, and we'll work within whatever limits we have to try and get an outcome that is in their interests and our interests. That's probably where I'd stop the answer.
Yeah. Do you think that their announcement today, while you're here at this inquiry, is perhaps somewhat of a...
You have asked your final question,
stalking
Mr. Fang.
horse and somewhat unfair on you?
Can't speak for the RTBU.
If I could turn to you, Ms. Griffiths. So firstly, when was the last time that your company was facing a strike action by your drivers?
I have been an employer of Redbus for 30 years, and touch wood, we've never had one.
I did
that 30 years.
Yeah, I did suspect that would be your answer. In full disclosure, I live on the Central Coast and have always viewed Redbus in a positive way. And I think there's been a lot made in this inquiry of the difference between those regions that have really never had public buses, have always had sort of family-run buses, versus those that are now having previously run government services replaced. Your organisation has 160 employees, is that right? Would you say that's a very different thing to when we look at something like Busways that has 2,800 employees but still calls itself a family business?
I really can't say because I don't know what it's like to have 2,000 employees, but but our mission is always about the employees. So it wouldn't matter how large we got, that would still be our goal, to always consider our community and our employees. So I imagine it'd be a lot the same.
When the government decided to put your contract out for tender just recently, I understand that was in March, were you surprised?
Yes, we were a little bit blindsided, but these things happen. And it wasn't in March, it was July 21
Okay.
that we were put out to tender.
When does that tender process occur?
Well, the tender process started in July 21, but it stopped in November 21. So they've now decided to recommence it again after they've finished the Sydney tenders. Mm-hmm. So the process had already started and then they stopped it.
Okay, and were there reasons given for why the contract wasn't going to be renewed? Because I understand that's quite unusual?
To this day, we're still a little bit confused of why our contract wasn't renewed. We have had debrief sessions with Transport New South Wales, and we still really don't have much of a real reason why we got put out to tender. So the tender process started and then stopped, and that one is probably the most confusing out of all of it. Yeah.
Can I ask, during the contract negotiations, was consideration given to the type of buses that would be employed in the region? So, for example, whether they were diesel or electric or whatever, was that part of the discussions?
No, all outer metro contracts were diesel at that stage.
Okay. And now that it's been put out to tender, is it just for the Central Coast, or is there some sort of bundling together with another region as part of that? Do you know?
Sydney, or all Sydney regions that haven't been tendered recently are up for tender, but for the outer metropolitan regions, only the 2 Central Coast regions are up for tender.
Okay. And do you currently have both of those?
We only have one, and Busways has the other.
Ah, okay. All right, understood. So they're both up for tender, so there is a possibility that you could end up with all of the Central Coast being within the same company, or being operated by the same company.
There is a possibility, yes, that one operator or 2 new operators could.
Yeah, okay.
Or one. Yeah.
If you were to lose that contract, what would be the impact on
there would be
your
no
business?
more. There'd be no more red bus. Yeah. With one.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll pause there and allow you.
I might just pursue some of that line of questioning, because I think this is really interesting in terms of, and the evidence that I've read and the feedback I've had from our local members up there is that Redbus are doing a very good and thorough job. There's no complaints. The provision is good. So I'm just keen to understand why we have such big disparity across providers. Is it related to size? Is it related to the philosophy of management whereby everything's either about the bottom line or it's not necessarily about the bottom line? I mean, you, in your evidence today, you've highlighted the fact that you listen to the community and you go out of your way to fill those gaps in service that, the community's telling you are there. Could you just elaborate on what you think? Because it's quite stark to me that no one's complained about Redbus, but people have complained about pretty much every other provider.
I don't really know why we're put out to tender, so I can't really explain that. All I can explain is our philosophy of how we run a bus service. And our goal as a bus company is, as I said, to be employer of choice and bus operator of choice. So for that mission, everything is about the drivers. So when you talk about pay rises and how you negotiate a wage increase with our drivers, it's all about how our drivers are. We worry about how our drivers are coping and making sure they get good working conditions and pay, because they are the face of your business. If they are not happy, then you're not going to get good customer service. So this is how we operate a bus. I'm not saying other operators don't, I'm just giving you Redbus as example. So our drivers, everything we do involves consultation. So if we're going to change anything, if we're changing any shifts, if we're going to change any part of their environment, where they have a meal break, everything is consulted with our drivers, because we want them to have a good working career.
Can I ask you, Ms. Chris, sorry to interrupt because I think it's relevant. Can I ask you then, so who is the union with coverage of those drivers? Is it the TWU?
TWU, so we're in a TWU area, but we don't have much of a coverage.
So this is the same union that's involved in other disputation with other providers, but you've managed to go how long without any industrial disputation?
I'm not exactly sure how long. I can just speak from my working life, and I've been there for 30 years and we haven't had one.
And coupled to that, you have virtually zero complaints about service provision. So something's going on here. Is it because of that sort of overall societal perspective that you seem to bring to the provision? Does that necessarily mean that you have to sometimes take a little bit of a a hit off your margin to provide that service?
That is correct. And something that needs to be considered when we were talking about wages earlier, Transport for New South Wales has to take some sort of role in those wages, because when you put in a tender, over 50 to 60% of the costs are wages. So if they're looking at a group of tender documents and one particular operator is lower than the market, and they choose that one, they've got to take in consideration that they're obviously going to have to pay those drivers at a lower rate or have different conditions of work. So then they're definitely going to affect the customer service outcome. So it's not all about, so what you were trying to talk about earlier when we're talking about the WPI, that's how we get indexed in pay. But when you put in a tender, if you're going to assume that your wages each year is only going to be the WPI, whereas other operators are paying their drivers a slight amount over that WPI, like we do. We have a floor in our enterprise agreement that we pay our drivers 2%. So if the WPI is lower than that, we still pay that because we feel that we need to stay around the CPI so that our drivers can pay their expenses. If you have another operator who doesn't do that and Transport New South Wales decide to choose those person in a tender, well, it's going to affect their customer service.
So that means this is a very important point, Ms. Griffiths. So if the market evolves to a point where you have larger providers with economies of scale on a lower wage price model, and it squeezes people like you out, you'll end up with a situation inevitably, I think, where the service provision drops because that's how they're turning a bigger profit, right?
I don't think we'll get squeezed out because of our wages, because we work really hard with our drivers to make sure they understand of what we can afford. So our wages at the moment are quite, we're competitive in the market rate. Where economies of scale affect us is in other items that we won't be able to compete. And yes, we will end up being out of the market and you'll be left with, you'll only have small amount of multinationals left.
Yeah, and that's an obvious concern to a sort of a family-run boutique business like yourself.
Yes, but if we were not performing and our costs were not in the market rate, I would understand why you put us up to tender, because we're not performing for the New South Wales people. But when you are performing with 98% customer satisfaction, 98% on-time running, 100% asset survey results, and your cost to government are at the market rate, I'm confused. And as a taxpayer, I see that as a problem. However, if we weren't performing, then yes, put us out to tender.
Sure. Can I just one more before I go on to back to Keolis? Did you miss any services during COVID?
No.
Okay, thanks. If I could just go back to Keolis on that original line of questioning I was pursuing.
Could I, just before you do, I know that Mr. Rath wanted to ask this one question.
Go for it,
So go ahead.
Thank you. And I see, Mr. Porter and Mr. Dunlop, that you've also said in your submission you have around 98% customer service as well. Is that correct? What I actually wanted to ask about, though, was your electric bus fleet. So I think you said 125 electric buses that are going to be rolled out. As you know, it's an important priority for government to reach net zero by 2050 and 50% reductions by 2030. With rolling out these electric buses, could you provide a little bit more information about that? And in particular, before you took over these different regions from the STA, was there any plan in place for them to roll out electric buses?
Thanks, Mr. Rath. With regards to the tender of STA Region 8, I was the bid director, Mark was the managing director, still is. To the best of our knowledge, there was no direction or strategy to bring electric buses in. In the tender itself, it was a wide remit to offer your innovation and ideas of how you would implement that strategy. We took a fairly aggressive approach because we know that bringing electric buses to the Northern Beaches community is something that's of a high level of interest. Keolis operates in 14 countries around the world. We have over 1,000 electric buses. So we've seen a lot of technologies. In our depots in Brookvale and Mona Vale, we've got space constraints. They're in densely urban areas. There's no view to grow the bus depots. So in that regard, we had to leverage the global innovation we had available to us to come up with a model that was slightly different from what's being done in other depots. So our solution there to deal with the space constraint is a pantograph charging solution that allows buses to charge faster and essentially get a quicker ramp up on the number of buses that we can bring into that network. It's something we're immensely proud of.
So not just that, had we have stayed with the STA, there probably wouldn't be electric buses being rolled out at the moment, but you would say in many other ways as well that the service that you provide is of a higher level of innovation and technology than what would have been there prior to you taking over those two regions.
Yeah, I think the STA was a wonderful organisation. It didn't have the advantage that Keolis has in terms of those 14 countries we operate and just the volume of technologies and contract models that we play in. Also, our partner ecosystem is really large, whether it's bus manufacturers, whether it's battery providers, whether it's people that install and deliver the charging solution. So it's a benefit that we had. To the key part of your question, Mr. Raft, when you look at Brookvale and Mona Vale in particular, a plug-in charging solution wouldn't work. There's just not enough space. And that's where a private sector company that was able to inform itself and take a little bit of risk on the solution has probably come up with something that's much larger that could have been delivered before.
Thank you.
Can I ask you, back to Keolis Downer, there's this particular service which comes up time and time again, the 350 service, which helped transport students to St Francis Xavier College, Merriweather High and Hunter School of Performing Arts via One Direct bus services. Why was that cut?
Comes back to the discussion we were having earlier around the where the key points people are travelling from Swansea. I'd also add there is a direct school service that still exists to St Francis Xavier. We didn't touch any of the school services that were in play. A number of those operate. But again, it's that feeder from Swansea to Charlestown and then being able to go to Newcastle, John Hunter Hospital, all the relative schools.
But this has been a particularly sore thumb. I've had feedback from local members up there that it was just highly patronised. The community are up in arms. They're asking for it to be restored. What's your position on that?
Certainly, as I also alluded to, we've brought in the 10X and Express service, which now provides a direct link into the CBD, in addition to the high frequency routes. That will be provided with electric buses when they come online. And additionally, there is quite an extensive network of school buses that operate.
No, but my question was very specific. Are you going to consider restoring that, or is that off the agenda?
I don't think at this point in time, on the data I'm privy to, I've not been in Newcastle now for a short while, but the data and where people were travelling to would not warrant, in my opinion, the reinstatement of a 350.
Okay, so this is an anomaly of concern when you've got community sort of up in arms about a particular issue and the company is saying that it's not an issue. What about the decision to effectively leave the communities of Redhead, Dudley and Whitebridge with no outgoing public services after 6:15 p.m. on weekdays and 6:36 p.m. on a weekend? Are you aware of that?
Certainly the fixed rate services cease at 6:30, you are correct. The on-demand operates. If anything were to be considered in conjunction with Transport for New South Wales, I would say a more an on-demand model would be the most appropriate there.
And this on-demand model, how does that, if I want to avail myself of that, how do I go about doing it?
I'll take this one, Mark. So,
Sure.
Mr. Buttigieg, we would consider the on-demand service as a public transport service, to your last question. It's capped to IPART regulated fares. And what it does provide is the ability for people to use an application on their phone or call somebody or use the website. There are a number of different ways to use the system.
Mr. Porter, you'd be familiar with technology just in your incidental day-to-day dealings with your family and other people. If you're an elderly person or a person with a disability or someone who's not particularly tech-savvy, what's your answer to those people?
Yeah, well, we think we're providing them a better level of service, because rather than going out and being exposed to the elements and waiting for a bus to come, the bus comes to your house or close to and then takes you to your point of interest. We think it's a higher level of service.
No, but I'm specifically referring to people who just don't have that capacity or desire to use an app, or with a disability who can't. So what happens to those people? They just fall between the gaps?
No, not at all. To the same degree that they would need to inform themselves of the bus timetable, they still have those same means to be able to book a service.
Can I ask, do you have a patronage incentive payment in your contract with the government?
There was originally one in the contract, and I don't believe there is anymore.
So it's been taken out. Was it replaced with anything?
Not to the best of my knowledge.
Okay. Is that correct for you as well, Ms. Griffiths? Do you know if you've got a...
Because we're still in the old contract, we
Right.
have the patronage
You
incentive
do.
payment.
When we had the fare-free days in the last school holidays, did that apply to your services as well? Were they fare-free during those 12 days?
Yes, but we were still paid a patronage payment for those. But it's so the amount of money we get is so immaterial that it doesn't make any significant changes to how much money we receive.
No,
It's so small.
Okay, I understand. Is it 5 cents a
Yeah,
trip?
it's 5 cents a paying passenger.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, understood. But you're saying then that there's no incentive payment at the moment for Keolis Downer under either the Newcastle contract or your Northern Beaches contract?
No, I don't believe there is.
And when it was there, sort of when did it go until? When was that operating until?
I have to say, in terms of the Northern Beaches contract, 100% there is no incentive payment. In terms of the Newcastle contract, I take it on notice.
When that incentive payment was in place, what percentage of the total income under the contract did that represent?
It was a very low number, Chair. So similar to Leanne's, so the New South Wales government could get a competitive process. They asked us to bid a line of patronage growth over the number of years we held the contract. Mm-hmm. We took a fairly aggressive view of that and backed ourselves to grow the service, because we thought there was a lot of untapped demand in the Newcastle region. And then it was 50 cents per passenger above or below the line. So similar to Leanne's position, it was a very low number because you were dealing at the edges.
Okay, so the patronage incentive payment wasn't acting as a patronage incentive effectively. Would that be correct?
Every bit of money helps or incentivises you to move in a direction, but I think the reason it was taken away might have aligned with your question.
So in terms of incentives then for you to increase patronage on your services, is it down to KPIs or is there some other contractual term?
In the contract, it's down to KPIs, but for ourselves, the key thing for us, we're a public transport operator. If we can show various jurisdictions that we can deliver services well, we can encourage people back to the network, we can embrace technologies to make services efficient. It helps us to win future contracts, and that's more lucrative than what we get out of the contract.
I understand that in the Northern Beaches region, at the end of 2021, the patronage was down. Obviously, there was COVID, there was a bunch of other things. On 2019 levels, it was down by about 58%, a bit less when you look at it compared to 2017 levels. What's that looking like now?
certainly passengers are starting to come back to the network. I caught the B line down here today, full standing load. Yes, COVID impacted and you had seating restrictions or capacity restrictions on the buses, so naturally the patronage did tail away. I would say it's coming back quite strongly in the northern beaches.
Are you able to take on notice the sort of the actual figures?
Certainly.
Just sort of the latest
Yeah, sure.
half year or quarter.
Just an important point there, Chair, was the last point that Mark made, was the seat restrictions held back the ability to meet supply. So we made sure that we complied with all New South Wales government regulation during the COVID period. Sometimes that meant we had to reduce the volume of people we could take on a bus in peak and off-peak services, just by trying to protect public health.
Thank you.
Could I just take you back to an earlier line of questioning I was pursuing with regards to bidding on tenders and industrial relations practices? In terms of Route 8, did you bid for that based on that two-tier arrangement that I outlined earlier, whereby you have two separate agreements and therefore...
Yeah. Sorry, Mr. Buddy. Do you mean Region 8?
Your Region 8, sorry.
Yeah.
What did I say?
Route 8.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Region 8.
That's fine.
Yeah.
We did not. In both contracts, in Newcastle and the Northern Beaches, we signed a memorandum of understanding with the RTBU, and we kept the conditions as per what they had previously.
And was that brokered by the representative body, Bus New South Wales?
No, it was ourselves directly with the RTBU.
Why did you make that decision to go down that approach, that industrial relations approach of that common instrument?
Yeah, it's very similar to Leanne's responses. Without a happy and engaged workforce, it's really hard to deliver the services. So we based our whole tender pricing on being able to work with the union and the drivers to provide good paying conditions.
Okay. Just going back to, now I've given you a little bit of a pat, but just going back to some of the other concerns, the local members via their constituents of hearing from...
Perhaps the other way around?
The local members from their constituents are hearing from commuters flagging that buses often run late and connectivity has reduced within the Newcastle transport network during your watch. Now, you've been operating this network for 4 years. Why does that issue persist? Because we've got these sort of great figures, we're 98%, everyone's feeling happy, but then these local members aren't telling fibs, right? So you've got this phenomena of the Hunter MPs who are not real happy, and then you've got the likes of the Central Coast MPs who are happy, to be frank. So it's not a case of Labor knocking the government. It's real, right? Otherwise they wouldn't be giving us this feedback. So can you address that?
I think I'd start by saying we agree that Red Bus provides a wonderful service in the Central Coast. With regards to Newcastle, it's a challenging city to provide highly efficient, highly effective services. Just the way the city's shaped and the destinations that people want to go with and the volume of cars on the road is slightly different to what the Central Coast is. I wouldn't want to go into the allegations made by city members in this forum. I would really love to just sit down with them and work through the detail and make sure we address those concerns.
They'd like political advantage to do that for us.
So can I ask you, in that we've sort of touched on this, but I just want to get some specifics. In that Newcastle transport network, how many on-demand buses do you have in service?
11, Mark?
No, I think it's 8.
8. And are they ever reallocated to fill gaps in service delivery?
No.
Okay.
So they're different types of buses.
Yeah,
so.
they're a different type of vehicle.
Okay. And I just want to touch on one of those points that was raised before about you get these routes which are not patronised, but you still get payment from the government. So the implication is that there's no incentive to go. But doesn't that inevitably feed back into your stats to say that route XYZ is not being well patronised? Taxpayers forking out the same money nevertheless. Therefore, inevitably, the government will look at that and go, well, we might cut routes XYZ and concentrate on the routes being used. Isn't that like the reason that you publish those figures back to the government?
It's a really complex case because it covers across a fair few points. So I think New South Wales government holds service planning for a reason, because the fundamental tenet of public transport is that you provide a service to the community, and sometimes it might just be one or two people on a service, but they may have no other option and they may need that service. So as an operator, we don't do anything unilaterally. We work with the government to understand, we consult widely. We try to make sure that people aren't disaffected. But as you can imagine, whenever you're developing a service plan, there are winners and losers. When we do our bids, in fairness to Transport for New South Wales, we have to really document who is a winner and who is a loser and what stakeholder engagement we've taken in place before we offer anything. There's still a dealer process to go before.
So, by way of example, Mr. Porter, on that very important point that you make, if over a successive period of years it was found that routes XYZ weren't being patronised, and the government said, well, what about we cut those, your part of your submission would be, but that's going to disadvantage people A, B, C. Is that how it works?
There are quite a few levers to this discussion. So the first thing you would look at is the density of people in that area. Then you'd look at the frequency of the service. You always try and maintain some level of service, even if it's less than what was previous, because as Mark said earlier, you've got a finite number of resources, and we're trying to drive modal shift, so we're trying to get those finite resources to where the most people want to use them.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, to a certain extent, you guys are the meat and the sandwich, right? Because the government's got this arm's length relationship. It's getting complaints from consumers that they're not being serviced. You've got a finite amount of resources, and the government dictates what routes will and won't be serviced. So it's a game that's hard to win from all perspectives, isn't it? Unless it's public owned.
I don't particularly agree, only in that I think we have aligned views between Transport for New South Wales, who wants to provide the best service it can to the people of New South Wales. Keolis Downer definitely has that view. From what I've heard from Leanne, she definitely has that view. And Byron and Jamie before us, I think, also share that view. We're trying to do our best for the people of New South Wales with the resources we have. I don't think it's about anyone being the meat and...
Well, it's a question of efficiency, though, isn't it? Inevitably, if you're going to run a service based purely on efficiency, people will suffer. And sometimes they might be people with a disability, or people who are elderly, or people who aren't on main lines. That's just a fact of life, isn't it?
No, I disagree with that completely. Okay. Mainly because we need to provide a service to the community who needs it. So the degree of affluence or the degree of ability never comes into it. It's really about trying to provide the best service.
But if that were the case, Mr. Porter, we wouldn't be hearing this feedback saying that there's massive gaps in services and people have got issues, unlike on the Central Coast. So it's kind of a bit, the evidence is contradictory to what you're saying.
I think the thing you would need to look at are the number of people in those catchment areas, the number of services, and how many people patronise the service. So I think I said before that we deal to 37 million passengers per year across the northern beaches in Newcastle. It might not be the same in some of the other regions.
Just got one question.
Order.
I've got one question. That's okay.
It's 12:30. You can ask one very quick
Thank
question,
you.
Mr. Fang.
Just noting that you said you met with the local MPs before, did any of the MPs that gave testimony in this inquiry come to you with those concerns before giving in the evidence to this inquiry?
Certainly the early 2018, when I started in Newcastle, I had discussions in relation to the 350 and went through a similar explanation that I've given you. So yes, I've met with Tim Krakenthorpe previously around some issues with Newcastle East and worked with his office to alter the route. What was proposed wasn't workable, but we worked together to, I think, come up with a good solution linking to Market Town.
Yeah.
So certainly we listen.
But since then, you haven't heard. They haven't come to you again.
All right, order. It's 12:30. I think you've got the answer to your question.
I did. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming along and for participating in the inquiry today. It's incredibly helpful.
Very helpful.
To the extent there are supplementary questions or questions taken on notice, the committee secretariat will be in touch and you'll have 21 days